And welcome to Hidden History, Stories from the Secret City. I'm Keith McDaniel, along with my co-host, Ray Smith. Good afternoon, Ray.
Hi, Keith. How are you today?
I'm doing good, doing good.
Good.
We have our guest today, somebody that's no stranger to the viewers of Hidden
That's
History,
right.
Dr. Todd Rider. And
Yes.
Ray, do you want to say anything about
I,
what
I,
Todd's
I,
going to be talking about today?
I'll talk just a little about it. Todd has been here before, and he has talked to us about the lessons from the forgotten creators. And we really have enjoyed learning that much of what we now know, and I often take for granted, came from these forgotten creators coming out of Germany. And he sent us a text or an email, I forget which, not too long ago, saying that he had some additional information he'd like to share with us. So we're glad to have you here, Todd. And just go ahead and give us your presentation, okay?
Sure. Well, thank you very much for having me back. I really appreciate it.
Mhm.
And the various accomplishments there at Oak Ridge during World War II and during the Cold War are a great example of revolutionary scientific innovation. So inventions and discoveries that really changed the world. And I was really interested in finding ways to improve revolutionary scientific innovation in the modern world. How can we get more innovation? And I decided to look at history and to see what has really helped to promote innovation at various places in the past. And of course, I could look at everything, but I didn't quite have time and resources to look at everything. So I had to narrow it down a little bit. And I narrowed it down really to two particular times in history. One is the US, that from 1940s to 1960s, there was really a golden age of innovation. And Oak Ridge was very much part of that. The rest of the nuclear program, Bell Labs, NASA, all things that your viewers are very familiar with. There was a second time that was really a golden age for innovation, second place, and that was the early German-speaking world. And people may be less familiar with that, so I'll spend a lot of time explaining that. I will go through these slides at about warp 8 or warp 9, but all these slides and a whole lot more is available on my website if anybody's curious. So in the earlier German-speaking world, this was from around 1800 to around 1945 in particular. There were a lot of revolutionary scientific innovators and innovations that were produced by whatever they had going on at that time. And so these were innovations in biology and medicine, in chemistry and materials science, in earth and space science, in physics and applied math, in electrical engineering and optics, in mechanical engineering, in nuclear engineering, and in aerospace engineering. And I won't go into those today, so you can breathe a huge sigh of relief. If anybody's curious about those, I have several thousand pages in my book you can download for free from online. That should keep you busy for a while. But I want to talk about really what was behind all this. Why did so many innovations come out of this early German-speaking world, and why did so many innovations come out of the US during the mid-20th century? Let me also define a few terms here. So the German-speaking world I'm talking about was not just Germany, but also the surrounding countries in Europe. They didn't always speak German, but that was the predominant language. So there were a lot of innovators and innovations that came out of this area. There was a lot of flow back and forth across these borders. And this is especially important, as I said, between about 1800 and 1945. Now, I don't want people to misunderstand me. So my study does not support nationalist bragging rights, ethnic bragging rights, the Third Reich. And I'm certainly not saying that this German-speaking world was perfect. Likewise, this doesn't claim that other places and times were not also good at innovation or shouldn't be studied. I think they should be studied. I mean, let's study all the innovation systems of history. Didn't quite have enough money to get there. So from these two innovation systems, the earlier German-speaking world and this golden age in the United States, I've identified what I think were really 10 major reasons why they produced so much innovation, certain systemic practices that they had. And so I'll step through these 10 different things. And for each one, I want to very briefly explain how the German-speaking world did it and promoted it, how the mid-20th century US did it and promoted it, and then how we could potentially do the same in the modern world to improve innovation nowadays. So the first one was cultural attitudes. And in the early German-speaking world, scientists were rock stars. It's really kind of hard to imagine this nowadays. Einstein is still the best known example, but there were so many others in physics, chemistry, biology, engineering, and these were, absolute public celebrities. Likewise, not just real scientists, but even fictional scientists in their books, in their movies, were regarded as intellectual heroes, held up as role models. Every kid should be like this. And to further encourage the kids, there were science clubs that got students into science. Here's a photograph from an early science club. This is a teenage Werner von Braun lugging his rocket around, his model rocket, back before he started aiming his model rockets at London. So that was the German world, and there were very similar things going on in the United States in the mid-20th century. Again, real scientists were regarded as intellectual heroes. They were constantly on magazine covers, named Person of the Year and everything. Again, it's kind of hard to imagine nowadays when, our idea nowadays of the Person of the Year is like just the latest teeny bopper or the latest sports star. Likewise, in the fictional works of this time, in books, in movies, scientists were intellectual heroes. If there's some great problem in the world, if the world is being attacked by giant mutant hamsters, then you don't call Superman, you call a scientist, and the scientist will fix it. Again, students were very much brought into this, encouraged in this by science clubs and by science kits, especially like A.C. Gilbert and Porter Chemcraft science kits. Some of these kits even had radioactive sources and Geiger counters that kids could play with on their own. Those are the good old days. So all those cultural attitudes could be implemented or improved nowadays in the modern world. We could begin certainly by elevating the social and the financial status of science research compared to, say, sports stars and pop stars and things. As you saw, the science kits were a very important part way back then. I think science kits nowadays could really help to encourage kids to get interested in science. And science fairs are a way that students can go beyond that and really learn how to do research on their own. We should also, of course, improve the salaries and the working conditions of the people who teach the science students, all the science teachers out there. And I think we should give much more media coverage to important scientific discoveries and to the people who are responsible for them, again, compared to the attention we lavish on other things in music and sports and so forth. The second factor was the funding levels. So this is for the German-speaking world, and on the vertical axis, there's a semi-log plot of how much money they were spending on science research, and it's in constant value, Deutschmarks versus time. And you can see that funding increased on this semi-log plot, funding increased exponentially for essentially a century and a half. Imagine that exponential increase in funding for a century and a half. And during that time, the funding essentially doubled every 14 or 15 years. That means that over the average, say, 40-year career of a scientist, by the time they retire, funding would have increased by about a factor of 6.8. And in turn, that means that for that retiring scientist, there's enough money to hire 6.8 new scientists. So you constantly have room for new scientists. And of course, there was even more room because so many of the scientists were able to go overseas and start careers there. Very similar, something here in the United States in the mid-20th century. There's an exponential increase in science funding during World War II. There was another exponential increase in science funding during the early Cold War. And yet after that, funding levels dropped and have remained fairly flat since then. So if funding is abundant, if there's an exponential increase in funding, then there's much more freedom to support revolutionary innovators and revolutionary innovations. And if funding is limited, then it really discourages innovation. There's great pressure that every dollar you spend has to have a guaranteed payoff, has to have a short-term payoff, can't be long-term. You can't take any risks with it. So I think that nowadays those lessons could be implemented. Now, obviously, exponential funding increases can't continue forever, but the most important part of that was that there was enough funding for all the scientists to do their thing. And I think we need to do a better job nowadays of matching the amount of funding and the permanent job positions to the number of scientists, the number of graduating students. So increase funding wherever possible, and if necessary, maybe even think about birth control of how many students are going into science. But if you do that, then most scientists, once they get their degree, once they're working, could actually spend most of their time and energy doing productive science research and not have to spend so much time and energy chasing elusive funding and chasing elusive positions.
Yeah.
And then, if there were that freedom, if there were enough funding, then the sponsors, the institutions that hire these scientists would feel less pressure, that it's okay to have a scientist who's working on something long-term instead of short-term. It's okay to have a scientist working on something that may not work out. That particular project may not work, but a different project will change the world. So it'd be much more freedom to support innovative research. The third point is the mentoring style. And in the early German-speaking world, there was a very particular style of mentoring, and this was described in biographies by a number of people who were educated and worked in the system. And they all describe how wouldn't just kind of take them on as slave labor in the professors' labs, but the professors wanted these German-speaking students to learn how to think for themselves, learn how to come up with their own ideas, how to pursue their own ideas. And the professors would teach them how to do that, but then kind of leave them on their own to do that. And this is described by Leo Szilard, very famous scientist who came to the US. Michael Polanyi was a polymath. And you can read similar accounts in so many biographies from people. Now, in contrast, if you look at biographical accounts of mentoring in the United States, even during this golden age, there's so many people who say, well, my professor wouldn't really give me enough freedom to do my own interests. My professor just wanted me to help with whatever the professor's own interest was, and just be a trained monkey in the lab, adding to the professor's own CV. And here is one particular example, but there's so many. This is John Bardeen. He ultimately went on to win 2 Nobel Prizes, not one, but 2, one for the transistor and one for superconductivity. And so he describes how back when he was a PhD student, he was shopping around for a thesis advisor, and he to the American professors, and the American professors just all wanted him to, come help fill in some small space in the professor's own book that they were writing. But then he talked to some of these refugees from the German-speaking world, and they very much encouraged Bardeen to think for himself, come up with his own ideas. They taught him how to find the best ideas, how to find the best approaches. And I think that ultimately led to his success. So I think we could implement that sort of mentoring nowadays. If you think about a parallel, think about people who are training to be Olympic gymnasts or people who are training to be concert pianists. They train from a very early age how to do that. They're just constantly practicing their gymnastics from age 4 or whatever. On the other hand, with scientists, you want very creative, self-confident, self-independent scientists. And yet we don't teach kids how to do that. Usually you don't get to do that until you're, fairly old as a scientist. You finally have an established position and funding. By analogy, it'd be like expecting a gymnast just to sit on the sidelines until very late in life. And okay, now you're 45, now you can go out there and do gymnastics for the first time at the Olympics. It just doesn't make sense.
No.
So I think teachers and research advisors should encourage students to pursue their own ideas, teach them how to do that, give them the freedom, and if at all possible, not simply use the students as unpaid or low-wage labor for whatever the professor's own interests are. In fact, since students are quite cheap, if there were a company or a foundation or a government agency that had a little money, it'd be quite easy to round up some of the most promising young students and just grant them the free time and the resources to pursue their ideas and give them, minimal guidance on how to do it, make sure they don't blow themselves up. But you could really change the world with a group of students like that. The fourth factor is the average age at which people finally finished their university studies and started doing research as a job. And in the early German-speaking world, if you look for Nobel laureates, but also people who didn't win Nobel Prizes but did important things, the average age at which people did this, finished their degree, if they weren't delayed by war or something, was around 22 or 23, depending on whether it was a PhD or an MD. So think about that. You're 22 or 23, you get your doctoral degree, you get a permanent job, and you get the ability to pursue your own ideas. It's almost unimaginable now, but there were so many people who could do it in this place and time. Now, if you look at the same data for the United States during the mid-20th century, the average ages were a little older, around 25. So they lost a couple of years compared to their German-speaking counterparts. But still, this is young by modern standards. And they didn't have to go do 3 postdocs after this either. So at age 25, they could immediately go implement their own ideas. Nowadays, according to latest data, the average age graduation with a PhD is around 31 or 32. And even after you get that PhD, you have to spend quite some time doing internships, doing postdocs, and before they finally trust you with the keys. And so if you look at the average age at which people get their first government funding grant, this data is available for the National Institutes of Health, NIH. And the average age for the first NIH grant is between 43 and 46. So again, think about Olympic gymnasts who are not able to actually go out and do gymnastics until they're 43 or 46. You wouldn't expect them to be very good at it. So I think that we should reduce as much as possible the average age at which scientists get their final degree and get independent funding. Ideally back to where it was before, to early to mid-20s, but at least as low as possible. And that can be done if you eliminate certain redundant steps in education and things like postdoc slavery. And if you do that, you're not only giving more years to scientists to be productive, but you're giving them their most productive years. So an extra 10 or 20 years when you're in your 20s and your 30s, it's when you have the greatest creativity, the most energy, the fewest non-research obligations. And so I think this is a huge factor in why there were so many revolutionary innovators back earlier and not so many nowadays. The fifth factor is interdisciplinary work. And in the German-speaking world, there was a very long tradition of having people who worked in multiple fields, studied multiple fields, made major innovations in multiple fields. This was true even before 1800 and certainly countless cases after 1800. It was a rather different story in the United States, even during its golden age. So most of the interdisciplinary people we had in the US were imported from the German-speaking world. The few grown and worked in multiple fields had at least learned from those German speakers, just as John Bardeen did, as I showed, or Linus Pauling, who did his doctoral work in Germany and then came back. So these people were heavily influenced by the German-speaking system. So I think it's very important to have some interdisciplinary researchers, and even in the golden age of the United States, there were not that many. Now, of course, we need people who are specialized. We need specialized to go do this specialized thing, that specialized thing. But I really think that the modern system should encourage at least some small percentage of students to study multiple disciplines, get really good at multiple disciplines. And that way they can make contributions to multiple fields, or they can take what they've learned in one field and apply it to another field. Or they can use the fact that they have a broader view to tell everybody else in the field, hey, don't go down that path. That looks like a dead end. Go this way instead. This looks more promising. And so have some students, some small fraction who are multidisciplinary. But I think that everybody, all students, all scientists, should really learn how to communicate their work clearly with other scientists and with the public, and be able to cross-pollinate ideas that way. The sixth factor is that there were certain level scientific managers who strongly supported innovation. And borrowing a term from history, I call these enlightened despots. So, like an enlightened despot monarch in history, they had a lot of power for one person, maybe too much power for one person, but they used that power not to enrich themselves, but to try to help their country or help their organization, help the world. And in the German-speaking world, there were a bunch of these people. Arguably the most important was this guy, Friedrich Althoff, who really helped to set up this whole system and trained a lot of the other despots around him. What all these despots had in common is that they all had very strong, very direct support of very high-ranking authorities above them, sometimes even at the very top of the government. And they also had a very keen eye for finding the best early revolutionary innovators and innovations. And once they found those, because they had strong direct support from above, these enlightened despots were able to offer long-term steady employment and funding to what they thought were the best people and the best projects. So allow them to succeed if they were going to. This was the German-speaking world. In the golden age of the United States, there was something extremely similar. These were some of the enlightened despots here. And of course, everybody will recognize Oppenheimer and Groves here. Very good example of this. In my opinion, perhaps the most important person was Vannevar Bush, who helped to set up the Manhattan Project as well as many other things. And he was kind of the godfather of this entire system. But again, these people had strong direct authority from above. In the case of Vannevar Bush and Leslie Groves, went all the way up to the president. They had a very good eye for the kind of innovators and innovations they wanted to support, and they had the funding. They had the opportunities to offer long-term employment to whoever they wanted below them. So I think we could learn a lot from that nowadays. The system nowadays is quite different. So peer review is used for virtually all funding decisions, virtually all employment decisions in research nowadays. And peer review is good to weed out bad ideas, but it's very difficult to get a peer review committee to all agree on some really new scientist, some really new scientific idea. They're so entrenched in the status quo. So even if we still have peer review, I think that at least some fraction of research funding should be allotted to enlightened despots. And you give them the funding, you give them the authority to just go find good people and go find good ideas and fund that. They are able to fund anyone they want for a number of years, and they would not be required that every one of those investments would necessarily pay off. Some will pay off, some won't, but the ones that do pay off could really change the world. A real question is how you find the best people to put in those positions of enlightened despots. How do you find a good Leslie Groves? And in the past, some of the despots were handpicked by the earlier despots. Vannevar Bush handpicked so many people in the US system. Some people just kind of accidentally arrived at their position by good luck and general force of will, again like Leslie Groves. But best methods to find and select those people nowadays, that's kind of an open question. Another thing that came out of my research is that these enlightened despots often worked in pairs, and they worked extremely well in pairs. And so a good example would be back here to Groves and Oppenheimer. So they worked as a pair, as a team, and Groves was generally focused upward on the problems above. Can we get enough funding? Can we stop interference from somebody else? And Oppenheimer was generally focused downward, the project below him, making sure all that ran smoothly. But there have been many examples of this kind of pairing in history. Another is Wernher von Braun, who was generally focused downward on the rocket programs. When he was in the United States, above him was James Webb, focused upward. And when von Braun was in Germany, above him was Walter Dornberger, focused upward. So those are some very important lessons. Where peer review is still used, I think it should be used in a blind fashion. So the peer reviewers are not awarding funding based on, who that researcher is or where they're located, but they're really awarding it based on who has the best ideas or not. And there are some good books arguing this by Donald Braben, who supported research in the UK. The seventh factor is what I call systems analysis. And this was practiced widely throughout the German-speaking world. Its principles were really articulated by people like Fritz Zwicky and Theodor von Karman. But the general idea is that you kind of identify a range of problems that you might like to solve. And then out of that range of problems, you break it down into different categories of problems, break those down into even subcategories of problems, and then start to rule things out. Say, well, I can't work on this subcategory of problems because it would take too much money to do that. I can't work on this because that's just too hard. But you narrow it down and you find which of these promising problems you can work on, and then apply the same sort of systems analysis to the solutions. So think about all possible solutions for a given problem and subdivide it into categories, subcategories, and then start ruling out solutions. Well, this solution will never work. This solution has the funding to do, but you identify the most promising solutions and you pursue those. And again, this was widely done in the early German-speaking world. It was also widely done in the mid-20th century US. A lot of think tanks used these methods, and the US nuclear program used these methods. So I think that kind of systems analysis should be taught and practiced in schools nowadays. And I think that the decision makers in government and industry and academia could use this kind of systems analysis to make sure they're pursuing the most important problems and not the least important problems, and to make sure they're pursuing the most important potential solutions for those problems. Even individual scientists can use the systems analysis to make sure they're staying on track, they're headed in the most promising direction. The eighth factor was limited natural resources. And for all of its history, the German-speaking world was extremely limited in terms of how many natural resources they had and what resources they had. And because of that limitation, it really forced them to be innovative in making the most of what they had. So they developed synthetic dyes, and then many of those synthetic dye molecules went on and became very promising drug molecules and other things. They developed a way to synthesize ammonia for fertilizer and explosives, synthetic rubber, plastics, synthetic explosives, synthetic foods and preservatives for foods, even synthetic blood plasma, and biotechnology to synthesize all kinds of things. So this innovation was driven by their limitation in resources. Now, this is one area where the United States had a very different experience. The United States generally had abundant natural resources on its own territory. And even for the things we didn't have, we could easily import those from around the world, from whoever did have them. You want Congolese uranium, you order Congolese uranium and it shows up on your shore. So the United States really did not have this kind of pressure to develop synthetic processes. Now, at the end of World War II, the US kind of inherited the German-developed synthetic processes, and it certainly used those, but there's really not been much incentive to develop new processes after that. But of course, nowadays, we worry so much about limited natural resources worldwide, about climate change, pollution, accumulation of waste. I think it would be very advantageous if we let those global limitations drive innovation again. And that could be done through giving proper incentives, government incentives and industrial incentives for innovative solutions to these problems. The ninth point was international rivalry. And the German-speaking world was just constantly afraid of, its life, basically its existence throughout its history. So every so often there'd be some major war, including World Wars I, World Wars II. And so rivalry would turn heated in the wars. But even between the wars, there was fierce industrial competition. Who was going to sell the most stuff? So competition between the German-speaking world and the British, the French, the US, and so forth. And this extreme level of rivalry, of competition, was a strong driver of innovation. They had to be as innovative as possible to have the best chances of winning these trade battles or trying to win the wars. Again, the story is somewhat different in the United States. There was less impending sense of international rivalry in the US for most of its history. And so there was less need for innovation. Now, things did really heat up approaching World War II. So in response to that, Vannevar Bush and others founded the NDRC and OSRD around 1940. From then on in World War II, it really drove innovation, this sense of competing with the Axis powers. And then even after 1945, the very heated competition with the Soviet Union during the Cold War drove innovation. Then around 1970-ish, the Cold War relaxed. And there was the strategic arms limitation talks, the SALT talks. There were other arms limitation treaties at the same time. In the space race, which had been so competitive for so long, the United States landed people on the moon. The Soviet Union did not contest that, did not say, well, we'll be the first ones to land people on Mars. So we continued space activities, but at a much lower level after that. And so there was much less pressure compelling innovation in the United States. There was still, some desire for innovation, but it gradually decreased over time. And then there was another sea change when the Soviet Union fell apart entirely. So there's really less sense that we need innovation for competition in the United States nowadays. We have a lot of competition, industrial competition, military competition, but in my opinion, we really don't feel the kind of pressure driving innovation that we should or that we used to. So those factors could be implemented in the modern world in a more peaceful fashion without having World War III or anything. And so I think we could have peaceful economic rivalry. In fact, you could even do it within a country. So just as we have rival sports teams within a country, you could have rival high-tech centers within a country. And those could compete to see which one can get the best scientists, just like who gets the best athletes, who gets the best projects, who gets the research funding. And that could really drive innovation even within a country and certainly between countries. So there were a couple of MIT professors who wrote a whole book about that. The final point is what I call industrial unity of purpose. In the German-speaking world, their companies were so afraid of foreign competition or so afraid of losing the next war, they were much less afraid of other rival companies in the German-speaking world. So each company was not really so afraid it was going to get backstabbed by the company next door, and not really so busy trying to backstab the company next door. They were all just trying to, save their country against international competitors. So as a result, the chemical industry in the German-speaking world was fairly unified. The electrical industry was fairly unified. The aircraft industry was fairly unified. The automotive industry was fairly unified. And these relatively unified industries would take some of their money and not only do their own research, but also dole out some of their money to universities, to the Kaiser Wilhelm Institutes, now called the Max Planck Institutes, and give money to those universities and get innovations back. Very similar story in the United States. So because the pressure, the rivalry with the Soviet Union during the Cold War was so intense, the weapons industry, all these various companies, were fairly unified. They weren't trying to backstab each other. They were all on the same team, all coordinated by the Defense Department. Similarly, the space industry was all coordinated by NASA or the Air Force. The nuclear industry, as you guys well know, was all coordinated by the AEC or DOE. So all different labs and companies all working together. And then in electronics, most of that was really consolidated at AT&T Bell Labs. So without lots of competition and backstabbing, but Bell Labs working as the preeminent place to develop transistors and things. I think we really need to relearn those lessons nowadays. Companies in the United States have learned a bad lesson instead. They've learned that if you spend a lot of your own money doing research to invent transistors, or spend a lot of your own money to invent lasers, pharmaceuticals, personal computers, smartphones, then rival companies within the United States can just turn around, take that product, and sell their own version of it. And so the lesson that companies have learned is don't be the dumb company that spends all your own money developing this stuff, spending money to develop this stuff. Be the smart company that doesn't spend any money on research and instead just steals other people's research once they develop it. It's a very bad lesson to learn. So I think that this could be reversed with appropriate policies nowadays. So through tax policies, patent policies, regulation, and so forth, give enough incentive to companies that they should do their own research. And once they do it, they can really profit from their own research. Now, there are a few other lessons along the way. One thing that really stands out from all these historical examples is that organizations treated their own employees as a long-term resource to cultivate, not short-term disposable components that they could swap out. And that's very different than nowadays. Also, historically, these organizations evaluated their scientists based on the actual quality of their work, the importance of their work, not just based on the numerical value, the quantity of how many publications they made or where they published their work. There are lessons for universities in all of this. If you look at these examples, like from the biographies of the German-speaking scientists, teaching is extremely important, and teaching is kind of a very low priority at many modern US universities, but teaching was extremely important back then and had a huge payoff in terms of the quality of young scientists that it produced. At companies, these older systems had leaders that were really looking to the long term for their company. They wanted their company to be as successful as possible long term. They were willing to spend several years developing a transistor, developing a new drug to do that. And nowadays, the leaders at companies are often really focused just on what's our stock price going to be tomorrow, or what are we selling for a product next year. And then for government labs, the government labs in the US were generally established during World War II or immediately after World War II. And they were focused on whatever the most revolutionary problems were at that time, like nuclear energy. But those problems have long since been reduced to practice. So I think we need to reorient the government labs on whatever the most important new problems are. Now, there are other factors that could be investigated. I named those. I named 10. But there are a small number of other things that could be investigated if somebody out there has the time and energy. So we could look at these various factors in the United States, in the early German-speaking world. We could look at other places. I mean, what was going on in France or Japan or someplace to promote innovation, and people certainly should study those things. And of course, I wouldn't want to rule out completely new approaches. So I like to borrow historically successful approaches whenever possible. But there might be entirely new approaches to innovation as well. So anyway, that is my spiel, that I think there's a lot we can learn from this early German-speaking system and from the US. In particular, I've identified these 10 different areas. And I think there are ways to implement all 10 of these factors in the modern world. And if we could do that, hopefully it would improve, increase the amount of innovation that we have nowadays. And the innovations that came out of these systems, think about, we're still using the, nuclear energy that was developed at Oak Ridge. We're still using the transistors that were developed back, 80 years ago, still using technologies from 100 years ago, various pharmaceuticals and things. So if we really have revolutionary innovation now, it would be to innovate products that could be quite useful, say, even a century from now. So I think people should think in those terms. What would be a revolutionary innovation that would be a very important part of life 100 years from now? And sci-fi is a good way to think about this. You don't necessarily have to invent the whole spaceship, but just kind of, picture yourself wandering around the spaceship and, pick any small part. What would a coffee maker 100 years from now look like? How could you improve greatly over the current state of coffee makers or anything else? So if people are interested, here is some reading material. What I've talked about is explained in much more detail in chapters 10 to 12 of my book. You can download that for free from our website. And here are some of the other books and sources that I cited. So if you're curious, you can go to my website and download this and download a lot of other stuff.
Wow.
All right.
Wow. Todd, let me ask you a question. What are your, you're talking about innovation. You're talking about, the way things used to be compared to where they are now. What are your thoughts on Elon Musk and the work that he's doing?
I think some of the work is important. I think, yeah, you may have found a counterexample where the press does give attention to that. But I would contend that the press is not giving attention to the actual scientists and engineers who are designing and building those electric cars or those rockets. The press is giving attention to the person in charge of the company.
Right.
And maybe he deserves attention, but if you compare to the olden days, you'd have the actual scientists on the cover of Time magazine, or actual scientists lauded in the German-speaking press. And so nowadays, yes, we do pay attention to some billionaires as well as sports stars and things, but we're still not really paying that much attention to the scientists and the engineers.
Okay. All right.
Good point. And again, your book is available online, writerinstitute.org. We'll get anyone there that is interested in it. You can download it or you can read it online. And there is a wealth of information there. We've had Todd on, I don't know, a number of times, and each time he's brought us a different aspect of what he's done in his research to bring out the insights, like he did today, on how innovation took place in various parts of our history, and then what we could learn from that to apply today. So, Todd, thank you very much for all the work that you've done and pulling this together and making it available free to anyone that wants to take advantage of it.
Thank you.
All right, very good. Ray, who do we have coming up next time?
Well, again, we're going to bring an old friend back. Katie Watt is going to come to us, and Katie, of course, is with Explore Oak Ridge, and we'll be focusing on tourism. We'll talk a bit about what has happened since the Oppenheimer movie came out and what we want to do to take even better advantage of the publicity associated with anything that's going on that has a connotation that we can tie to Oak Ridge. And of course, one of the things she's proudest of are these little 3-minute videos from Katie the Kayatron girl. And they're taking a slightly different approach in the future to what they're doing with her. And I think it'll be good to have our audience catch up with what Katie's doing and what she's planning from Explore Oak Ridge.
All right, very good. All right, folks, thanks for watching. We'll be back in a couple of weeks with a new Hidden History. Welcome to Hidden History, Stories from the Secret City. I'm Keith McDaniel, along with my co-host Ray Smith. Good morning, Ray.
Good morning, Keith. Good
Uh,
to be here today, huh?
well, yeah, it's a pretty day outside here in Tennessee, so
It is.
a little warmer than it has been, so that's nice. We've got a returning guest today, so why don't you go ahead and
Oh,
introduce him?
yeah, Dr. Todd Rider is with us from the Rider Institute, and as you know, we've had Todd on a number of times. I don't know, maybe up to 4 times now, I believe, and he's got a couple of more that we want to include. This one, and then in a few weeks, we're going to bring him back again for a part 2 of this particular Forgotten Creators series. And I want to mention, Todd, I don't know if I've told you this, but of all of the people that watch our Hidden History Stories from the Secret City video cast, of all the guests that we've had on, yours has been the most viewed. So you're our top guest, and we appreciate you for that.
Oh, wow, it's quite an honor. Well, I'd like to thank the members of the Academy, and I'd like to thank my agent, family.
You're just getting ready for tomorrow night, aren't you? Academy. Well, when we're recording this, tomorrow is the Academy Awards. So,
all right. Well, Todd, without further ado, go ahead and bring us up to date on anything that you want to regarding your Forgotten Creators, but also we're looking forward to your presentation today.
Sure. Well, thank you both very much for inviting me back, and please jump in anytime along the way if you have any questions or suggestions. So I've given previous presentations, as you mentioned, to Hidden History and to several museums about the wartime German nuclear program and the progress toward developing nuclear weapons there. This is a presentation about the delivery methods that they were developing. So methods of delivering any potential nuclear weapons to Allied targets during the war. And this is also an updated version of what I've given previously. So a lot of new archival evidence. And so this information comes from many archives all around the world. And I'm not the only one who's found this. This is, largely due to many, many people who've been digging for literally decades through these archives. So this information has been slowly declassified and rediscovered in these archives. I should also mention that everything I'll be describing here comes from purely unclassified sources, so please don't shoot me. And the topic here is the nuclear triad, and we think of this as a post-World War II Cold War concept developed by the United States and the Soviet Union. The notion of the nuclear triad is that there are 3 different methods, independent methods, of delivering a nuclear payload when you care enough to send the very best. And one of those is to have land-launched ballistic missiles. The second is to have sub-launched missiles. The third is to have intercontinental jet bombers. So obviously the US and the Soviet Union have had this throughout the Cold War and since the Cold War. But what I can show from this archival evidence is that these approaches, this concept, actually originated in Germany during the war. And it's still unclear just how close to operational Germany became with all 3 of these elements, but they were working very, very seriously on all 3 methods of delivering nuclear weapons. So I want to give a brief summary of the nuclear payloads they had in mind, and then today we'll discuss the land-launched intercontinental missiles, and there's a lot of archival evidence on that. So that will be part 1, and then part 2. Hopefully in the near future, we'll discuss sub-launch missiles and intercontinental jet bombers. Let me start with a brief overview of the nuclear payloads. And from the archival evidence, I've seen quite a bit of information about 3 different nuclear payloads, 3 different nuclear designs that they were very seriously working on and developing. And so you have to think about what would be required to carry these to some target. The smallest had a mass of perhaps 300 kilograms or so. It was about the standard size of a normal German 250 kilogram bomb, so relatively easy to deliver. It had a small yield, probably much less than a kiloton of explosive nuclear yield. And it appears that this was tested in 1944 and 45. So there are a number of sources talking about this. There was even a German prisoner of war who was captured and mentioned he'd actually been handling a stockpile of these weapons, and he drew a detailed diagram showing the inside and the outside, the correct details of these weapons. So that was small. Here was the medium-sized version. This was a fission bomb, actually quite similar to the U.S. Gadget or Fat Man. This was a little smaller in size. It had a mass of about 2,000 kilograms to 2 tons. Think about, delivery methods for, carrying 2 tons to a target. If used with a full load of nuclear fuel, it'd probably have a full nuclear yield of several tens of kilotons, about comparable to Gadget Fat Man, maybe even somewhat larger yield. And there are so many sources that describe this weapon and describe the progress, even describe the testing of it, that we actually have a very good idea of the specifications of this weapon. So here in the upper right, I've shown the specifications for this compared to the US version. So that was small, medium, and here is supersized. There are over 30 sources that actually describe a full-blown German H-bomb. It seems almost impossible to believe. The other countries, the US, Soviet Union, were not doing H-bombs till the 1950s. But over 30 sources from the time that describe very serious German development of a weapon with an expected megaton yield. The weapon would have a total mass of 6 tons, about 6,000 kilograms. It used both fission and lots of fusion fuel, used lithium deuteride, exactly as was developed at Oak Ridge after the war. This was apparently not tested during the war, but they expected if the war had continued, they would have tested this sometime later in 1945 or maybe 1946. So you have to think about delivery methods that could carry a 6-ton payload to targets during the war. And again, there are many, many, many sources that all describe this weapon. So now let's get into the land-launched intercontinental missiles that could carry one or more of those weapons. First up is liquid propellant missiles. Everyone is quite familiar with the German V2 rocket that was used during the war. The scientists called it the A4, the fourth out of a series of these rockets they're developing. It had a length of 14 meters. That's quite important because soon we're going to see longer versions of this. It could carry a payload of 1 ton, so it could easily carry the smallest nuclear weapon, but not the larger ones. There may have been ways to boost it up to 2 tons. And they actually built over 6,000 of these during the war. Now, somewhat less familiar is the A9 or the A4B, and this was an A4 or a V2 with wings. The wings would help to glide upon reentry instead of coming straight down, and so it gave it a longer range. And officially, from the history books, at least 10 of these were built during the war. At least 2 were launched. Both of those were destroyed in flight. But there are still questions about, did they perhaps get further with that? So keep these designs in mind, especially the standard A4 here with 14 meters. And then there are modified versions. So, what other researchers have found in the archives is more and more evidence that those were not the most advanced German rockets. There were more advanced German rockets. Here is one simple modification. This was found by the British researcher and author Philip Hinchell. So in British archives, he found captured German blueprints showing a central compartment in the A4 or the V2. So on the left is the real blueprint. On the right is Hinchell's reconstruction of what this would have looked like. And this would be a compartment for potentially a much heavier payload, perhaps the 2-ton fission bomb. Further modified versions. So we know that after the war, the captured German rocket engineers in Russia and in the United States started reconstructing their V2s, their standard A4s with 14-meter length, but they also started building improved A4s with a greater length and a greater range. So in the Soviet Union, the standard V2 or A4 was rebuilt as what became known as the SS1 or the R1, so 14-meter length. But by the 1950s, with the aid of all these captured German rocket engineers, the Soviet Union was building and fielding the SS2 or the R2, which was a stretched version with a length of about 18 meters. So 18 meters long let it carry more propellant, which gave it greater range. Of course, the greater propellant had greater weight, and so the engine had to be upgraded with improved thrust as well. Then by the late 50s, they were building and fielding the SS3 or the R5M with a length of 21 meters and even greater range. And Werner von Braun and the other Germans in the United States were doing the same thing. They were building much longer versions of the A4, up to 21 meters long. And so these are what we know as the Redstone or the Mercury Redstone, the Jupiter C. But the fact that these unconnected teams of German engineers after the war were developing, extremely similar stretched A4s suggests that this was based on wartime work, at the very least wartime designs, and possibly wartime construction of stretched A4s. So here on this table, I've shown the specifications in the left column here for the standard A4, and in the right columns for these post-war versions. And then in blue, I've shown the estimated specifications for what stretched wartime versions of the A4 might have been like, and what their ranges would be. I've also shown the effect of the payload. So if you have a standard 1-ton payload, you can go a little further. These could all lift a 2-ton payload. They could lift the medium-sized nuclear bomb, and have a somewhat shorter range as a result. Now, there's actually evidence that wartime Germany was seriously working on these. Here's some of the first bits of the evidence. These were engineers and writers with deep knowledge of what had been going on in Germany during the war, knowledge of the rocket programs at Peenemünde in northern Germany. And after the war, they wrote about a rocket design called the A8. So not the A4, the A8. And they mentioned that it had an upgraded thrust, upgraded engines, about twice the thrust, and that it had a greater length, so length up to 18 or 20, even 22 meters long. And so this kind of matches what we would expect for that upgraded, longer A4 rocket. So that was a design. Did they actually build it? Well, here is a wartime report. This is from U.S. intelligence. They captured a prisoner of war, interrogated this person, and found out that this person knew of German rocket production in southern Germany at a town called Friedrichshafen, very near the Swiss border. So this was 1943. And this prisoner of war said that they were making rockets there. And these rockets were so long, it took 3 railroad cars to haul out each rocket. Now, a standard V2 or a standard A4 was designed so it could be carried on 1 railroad car. You might have to take the warhead off, but you could carry it on 1 railroad car. These were huge rockets to require 3 to carry them out. And it was not just one crazy guy who was telling this story, but they captured multiple prisoners of war who all had experience with the same facility at Friedrichshafen, and they all said yes, they were building larger rockets there, building rockets with a mass up to 25 tons, whereas the standard A4, fully fueled, only had a mass of about 14 tons, so much larger rockets. And then after the war, Allied investigators went to Friedrichshafen and other places, and they found evidence that these things were built. So here from a post-war investigative Chaos report, they talked to people on the ground in Friedrichshafen, and the German engineers said, yes, well, during the war, we were building rockets with longer propellant tanks. But of course, we never intended to actually use those rockets. No, we were perfectly innocent. So here's one report talking to one set of people. Here's a different Chaos investigator report talking to a different set of people. Yes, during the war, we built these longer rockets, these longer tanks, but still, same story. We never launched them. We never even dreamed of launching these things. No, no. Interestingly, this report also mentions that they were contemplating a piloted, a manned version of these rockets, requiring a pilot to steer it. And apparently, there were several eager volunteers trying to get on board the world's first piloted launch. Here is more evidence that these were not only built but even launched. This is from Alan Dulles, so kind of a super spy during the war. He sent lots of reports from Europe back to DC, and this is from 1943. So he reports successful launches of the standard A4, but he also reports that they had built versions up to 20 meters, and they had launched versions up to 20 meters long, and that, quote, they always exploded in air. Here is a similar report from a different source. This is from 1944. Reporting that in addition to the standard A4 rocket, they have launched longer versions, anywhere from 18 to 25 meters long, and that these versions often come to grief, as it says here. So there are problems associated with making these longer. And for insight into those problems, this is a post-war report by one of the Russian officials that rounded up German rocket engineers and then used them for the post-war Soviet rocket program, and says that after the war, indeed, they built longer versions of these. And until they finally figured out how to solve the problem, the longer versions, because they were longer and still used the same guidance system, it confused the guidance system. And so these longer rockets had a tendency to, quote, enter an unexpected self-oscillation mode, which is not exactly what you want in your rocket. But anyway, suggests that, the Germans really were building longer rockets. And the reason we haven't seen more of them in the history books is that they were prone to these sort of difficulties. So the question is, how far did the German engineers get in solving these difficulties during the war? Here is further evidence. This is from a reporter named Charles Murphy, and he was really in tight with the U.S. Defense Research Establishment. So he kind of knew everything, knew everybody. And in life, in 1946, after the war, based on all of his buddies in military intelligence, he reported that there was a 1945 model of the German rockets, that it was improved. It had a much greater range, so probably it was a larger rocket. And he says that unfortunately, none of them fell into our hands. They were all captured by the Russians. And he goes on to explain that most of the major relevant production sites were captured by Soviet forces, not captured by the Americans. So here actually is a document from the Soviets. So these are specifications, blueprints on the left for the standard A4, for the A4 with wings, the A4B or the A9, and then for an A9 sitting on top of what was known as the A10, a booster first stage. So a much larger rocket, a two-stage rocket. This would have had range up to 5,000 kilometers. So this could have been launched from Germany and could have reached the United States or reached deep inside the Soviet Union. So here are captured Russian versions. And on the right, this is an original German version. This is from the Deutsches Museum archive. And so, question is, was this simply a paper design for a large two-stage rocket, or did they build it? And there's quite a bit of evidence that they built this one as well. And I won't drag you through this in detail. People who are curious can find all this on my website, read it at your leisure. But there are many, many sources reporting that they built these larger rockets. They were planning on launching these larger rockets. So wartime sources reporting that they have what was called a V4, which they could launch from Germany and reach the United States. And wartime U.S. officials that knew all about these rockets were very concerned that they'd be launched to the United States. And Albert Speer, a German official, reporting that they expected to have these ready for firing against America very soon. as of late 1944. Here is a very interesting report. This is from the U.S. astronaut Gordon Cooper, one of the original Mercury 7, also a Gemini astronaut. And being a NASA astronaut, he was hanging out a lot with the German rocket engineers working at NASA. So hanging out with Werner von Braun and with other engineers. And he said that according to the Germans, that at the end of World War II, there was, quote, a manned rocket sitting on the pad, all tested out, all fueled up, all ready to go. It was intended to drop a nuclear warhead on New York City. And that launch came within about a week of actually happening when the war ended. So quite dramatic testimony. And this is just, one of several examples of mentions of a pilot on this rocket. More examples here. There's so many sources, completely independent sources, very knowledgeable sources, and they are all singing the same hymn. They're all reporting the same story. So Walter Dornberger, the general who was in charge of the German rocket program, here is a biography of one of the Germans involved in the program. He came to work for the United States after the war. And a brief bit in the biography says, oh, yes, during the war, he was developing the guidance system for the A-10 two-stage rocket to hit the United States. Now, if it was just a paper project, if there was no two-stage rocket, why was he actually building the guidance system for it? And so many other reports. This is another prisoner of war report. It's a captured German, a chemist from the Peenemünde rocket facility, who says, oh, yes, we have 18-meter rockets that we've been mass producing, so 18 meters longer. And we have the A-10, 23 meters longer. And that has actually been built, at least in prototype form. And survivors from the concentration camps who were working on the rocket programs, and multiple survivors, multiple prisoners, reported overhearing Werner von Braun and other officials talking about these large rockets to strike the United States. Still more evidence, still more information. And the Navy Secretary Forrestal described these longer range rockets that were being mass produced or on the verge of being mass produced. The U.S. Army Ordnance Office, investigating after the war, described these very long range rockets that would have been used in the very near future if the war continued. The French investigators, as well as U.S. and Russian French investigators, described these rockets and said it was intended to launch the A-9 and A-10 to transport atomic bombs to the United States, and that this would have been a mass attack launched within just a few months if the war had continued. Still more evidence is actually from the U.S. War Department, now the U.S. Department of Defense. So their own press release from the U.S. War Department after the war said, oh, yes, we learned through our investigators after the war about the German, quote, experiments with the atomic bomb and experiments with piloted again, rocket missiles that could cross the Atlantic. So it mentions this, but doesn't actually provide the details. Now, for more details, here is a very interesting set of blueprints. And they came from this German rocket engineer, Heinz Stölzl. So I should mention his background. After the war, almost all of the German rocket engineers were scooped up by different countries, by the United States, by the Soviet Union, by the British, by the French, even a few elsewhere. And so they were immediately put to work on super secret programs in those countries. And they kind of had to keep their mouths shut. Heinz Stölzl here escaped to Switzerland, and so he was able to blab more freely than the rest. Here he is in this photograph. This was taken in 1942 after the first successful test launch of the A4, the V2. So they're all being congratulated on their achievement. And in the back in a dark suit, this is Werner von Braun grinning from ear to ear. Here's Walter Dornberger, the general in charge of the program. And in the back, in the suit here, this is Heinz Stölzl. So he was part of this program to develop the A4 at Peenemünde. And then in the later years of the war, he was transferred to a facility in Thuringia in central Germany. And so here's an envelope from him. He was receiving mail at a fort in Thuringia. So he was working at some facility in Thuringia that was not the well-known Nordhausen Mittelbau facility. This was a different, even more secret facility. So he escaped Switzerland after the war, and he redrew his blueprints of what he'd been working on during the war. And then ultimately, his daughter immigrated to Australia. So these blueprints ended up in Australia, of all places. But these blueprints show a manned rocket. But if you look at it, it actually shows two pilots here. So not one, but two. And previously, I'd never seen anything like this. And I'd shown this to various experts. They'd never seen anything like this. Occasionally, you'll see a wartime dream of a rocket with one pilot, but not two. So it was very unusual, very strange. Also, this is a longer version. This is 18 meters long, if you look at the math here. So was that just some paper design, some pipe dream from Heinz Stölzl, or was it real? Here is an article from the New York Times from October 1944, so well before the end of the war. And this article is amazingly insightful. So the New York Times reporters were on the ground in Europe. They were talking to Allied officials, investigators, and they used anonymous sources, but extremely well-informed sources. And so according to this New York Times article, Hitler had ordered the rocket program to shift from the standard A4 to building much larger, much more powerful rockets. And it describes these rockets as looking like an airplane in shape. In other words, these rockets had wings. So we're talking about the A9, and these rockets would be able to reach the United States. So we're talking about the A9 sitting on top of the A10. It says that, America will soon know what war is. But what is truly interesting is that this report says the rocket would be controlled by humans. So not an automated guidance system, but controlled by humans. And it would carry, quote, two members of Heinrich Himmler's recently founded SS Air Force. So confirmation of the two-man rocket here. And to tie into the nuclear question, this even describes the nuclear weapon that this rocket would carry, and says that to trigger the nuclear weapon, electrical signals are sent both to the nuclear component, so in other words, a high voltage neutron initiator to initiate fission reactions at the center of the bomb, and simultaneously, electrical signals are sent to the conventional explosives. In other words, the conventional explosives surrounding the nuclear material to implode it. So this gives an amazingly detailed and accurate, declassified, unclassified version of the German, and for that matter, the American nuclear designs at the time. But yeah, two-man rocket here. And still more evidence. I was digging through NARA and found a bunch of documents in NARA in the archive at College Park. These were from the Army, the U.S. Army, in April 45. When they had captured and they were starting to investigate things in central Germany in Thuringia, and says, oh, by the way, we stumbled across this underground facility that is building something they call the V4, which has two pilots, a two-man rocket. So several different documents here describing mass production of the two-man rocket at an underground facility, which was not the better-known Nordhausen. And this underground facility was so large, it employed 20 to 30,000 workers, including a lot of French. So these workers were all freed by the invading forces. They went back home, and the French promptly blabbed to their local paper. And so here is a French article about this facility building the V4 underground. Here's further confirmation this facility existed. So from a couple months later, from June of 45, here is a cover letter, talking about this underground facility, which was not Nordhausen. And yet all we have is this brief memo, this cover letter. We don't have the detailed reports on this facility. So those reports must exist. The Allies were there, and yet the reports still seem to be classified to this day. So kind of think about the implications of all this. Here are massive German facilities during the war in 1944 and 1945 that are mass producing a two-man spacecraft, something designed to carry two pilots into space. And that would not be replicated until the 1960s for the Soviets with the Vashkod program and in the United States with the Gemini program. But here they were in 1944 and 1945 being prepared to launch two astronauts into space. It's just mind-boggling. Or I don't even know if they'd call them astronauts. I mean, in the US, they're astronauts. In the Soviet Union, they were cosmonauts. I asked my wife what they should be called if they're Germans. She suggested astronazis.
Oh no.
Exactly.
And still more investigative reports. So this was from the U.S. Navy investigating after the war, and they compiled over a 450-page report that still doesn't get into all the details. And it talks about very serious German work to develop the A9, A10, this two-stage rocket, and that this, would have been completed if the war had not ended when it did. And it says, quote, "It is now obvious that the Germans realized and have accepted for years the fact that a controlled missile is the natural vehicle with which to transport atomic explosive." More prisoner of war reports. So this was a prisoner of war captured in early 1945, actually several different ones. And one of them reported that near Peenemünde, a little further east of Peenemünde, they were building not the standard V2s, not the standard A4s, but they were building and actually launching, testing a version that was 30 meters long. So that would be the full A9, A10. And that they were testing the explosive charge that would go on it, the very special explosive charge, and that even 1/25th of the explosive charge produced devastating results. So say like a kiloton instead of 25 kilotons. And then this report was, confirmed, supported by other independent prisoner of war reports talking about the development of the nuclear weapons to, quote, "destroy England in one blow," and so forth. But the A9, A10 was not the end of the line. It was not the largest rocket, believe it or not. There was something called an A11. So the A11 would be a very large first stage, with the A10 as the second stage, and then the A9 as the third stage, so a three-stage rocket. Boris Chertok, the Soviet official in charge of these captured German engineers after the war, said that the Soviet investigators learned that in 1941, Werner von Braun and others gave a killer sales pitch to Hitler, and as a result, they got support at the highest level to work on the three-stage A9, A10, A11. And then after the war, when von Braun was in the United States, he was talking very proudly about this A9, A10, A11 rocket. And he said, yeah, we were developing these rockets to carry a 6-ton payload to the United States. So a 6-ton payload ties into that 6-ton bomb, the full-fledged German H-bomb, the largest of the 3 German nuclear weapons. Then he suddenly went very, very quiet in public after that. He never again talked about the 6-ton bomb and this large rocket that he was developing. But there must be, detailed reports. Von Braun must have sat down with U.S. interrogators after the war and described all this in detail, or even turned over wartime German documents on these programs. There were other post-war Allied interrogators who found evidence of these larger rockets. So they described the A9, the A10, the A11, even all the way up to the A15. And so, here on the left, here on the table on the right, all the way up to the A15. They note that the A15, however large that would be, probably never progressed beyond the drawing board stage, but they don't make the same caveat about the others. So it's a very open question, just how far did they get in building rockets that were just exactly how big? Now, those were rockets under Werner von Braun's supervision during the war. There's evidence for a possibly completely different set of rockets. These were being developed and built in German-occupied Czech territory in Bohemia. And these were called the V3 or V4, but they were not necessarily the same thing as what von Braun and people had in mind for a V3 or V4. So we'll call them the Bohemian versions. And after the war, many Allied investigators found evidence of these things. So a V4 rocket capable of being fired from Prague to the Americas with a nuclear payload being produced at plants in Czech territory, and that most of the relevant plants, the people, everything had all been captured after the war by the Soviets instead of the Americans. So these Allied investigators who were sneaking around found evidence of actually, quote, the completed V4. There was at least a completed prototype there. That prototype had a much longer range than standard German rockets, and had a nose with, quote, a new and more powerful charge. I wonder what that could be. So all this was captured by the Russians. Here are other documents showing how much the Russians captured. This was somebody who escaped from the Russians to the West, but said, yeah, unfortunately, what the Russians got was all of the wartime German information on a long-range manned rocket bomb. So wartime programs on a manned rocket with very long range, and the Russians got this information. Here is another escaped person who said that, yeah, the Russians were having us rebuild wartime stuff that had basically twice the thrust, twice the propellant, twice the size of the standard V2, standard A4. Still more reports, all these different reports on the Soviet program, reporting that after the war, the Soviets were using not only the standard A4, but larger versions, including two-stage versions. So something called a V3, V4, and they had two stages. They were larger than the standard A4. These rockets are similar to the German V-type, but larger in size. Reconstructing the wartime A4, reconstructing the wartime A9, reconstructing something called the wartime G2, which is virtually unheard of in other documents. Still more information on the post-war Soviet program. Prisoners who escaped and describing that the Soviets after the war had apparently captured German rockets that weighed 40 tons, so much, much larger than a standard A4. And they were doing experiments with piloted versions of these that hold two pilots. So a two-man crew coming back to the two-man rocket. So many different independent sources of evidence all saying the same thing. Talking about the A8, which you've seen before, stretched A4, and a range able to reach the United States, and greatly improved accuracy for these rockets as well. Here is a very impressive report that came out of the Soviet Union, and this is from a witness, or multiple witnesses, who actually saw captured German rockets in the Soviet Union, and they say that the rockets were approximately 40 to 45 meters in length. That is much larger even than the A9, A10. So if these bits of information are correct, then this would be something like an A9, A10, A11 prototype that had been built during the war, and then captured by the Soviets, and undergoing test by the Soviets after the war. And says that the Soviets found a lot of the stuff at Arnstadt in Thuringia, one of several large rocket facilities. Clearly, there's all this evidence that the Germans were building these large rockets during the war. So what did they plan to do with them? We can actually read their own documents, their own blueprints, and see what they had in mind for a purpose. This is from Heinz Stölzel, again, who escaped after the war. And so here are, along with his rocket designs, these are graphs of the planned trajectory for the rocket, showing it'd be launched from Germany. It would go up, first stage, second stage, and then come back down. And thanks to its wings, it would go on a gliding reentry, kind of like the space shuttle, and end up in New York City and see the sights on Broadway. And over here on the left, this is from the Deutsches Museum. It's a wartime document, which shows a tourist map of New York City. Here's Manhattan here, with this giant bullseye on it, showing the expected, blast range of this thing once it hits Manhattan. So we have information from so many sources, all saying the same thing. For example, many different German officials who were very high ranking, very much in a position to know, all said that the large rockets were actually built. So we have information from Hitler's inner circle that they were building these things. They planned to launch them at the US to, quote, make the USA amenable to peace. From Otto Skorzeny in the SS, that by March 1945, they had built a rocket capable of bombarding New York or Moscow. And from Heinrich Himmler's adjutant Werner Grothmann, that they had built prototype giant rockets during the war. So at the end of the war, Hitler's inner circle was contemplating whether they should use their prototype rockets and their prototype nuclear weapons and launch a desperate strike. And of course, they never did. But that is from German officials, same story, different verse from Allied wartime intelligence from people who knew. So wartime intelligence reporting that we very quickly learned that there was a rocket with a weight of 68 tons, much, much larger than a standard A4. And, they were building enough of these things that Allied intelligence very quickly and easily learned this. Again, the reports about rockets so large, they required 3 railroad cars just to carry one rocket. This is a very high-level U.S. report from early 1945 saying that larger rockets are known to exist, rockets with a length up to 68 feet, as opposed to the standard 45 feet for conventional A4 or V2. So all these wartime intelligence things reporting the same thing. All of the Allied political leaders in a position to know reporting the same thing. The large rockets were actually built. Here is from Winston Churchill, who is not really known for, fluffing up the Germans. So after the war, he reported that we just barely won the war in time. He has, seen and had reports of exactly what kind of weapons Germany had in store for Great Britain if the war had continued any further. This is from a U.S. senator saying that he has personally visited some of these German facilities with investigators after the war. And so with his own eyes, he has seen these more advanced rockets. And he knows that, they were ready or almost ready when the war ended. Here's a different U.S. senator who's also visited the same facilities and also reports he's personally seen these super rockets that would have struck New York if the war had continued. So many different sources. Here are Allied military leaders. So General Karl Spaatz reporting, the Germans were readying a transatlantic model of the rocket when the war ended. From General Henry Arnold in the Army Air Forces, the A-10, a very large rocket intended especially for New York, was being built. And another one of these press releases that at the end of the war, they were mass producing or scaling up for mass production of these rockets able to strike the United States. From Colonel, later General Donald Putt in the U.S. Army Air Forces, it wasn't until we got investigators there on the ground we discovered these advanced rockets. So the same story from all these sources, both the German sources and the Allied sources. And they're saying that these rockets had reached at least the prototype stage, that they were being mass produced or on the verge of being mass produced. And that's very different than the usual story in the history books, which is that these larger rockets were just purely a paper design. So the people who've seen them with their own eyes know it was not a paper design. And of course, in fact, it would take many years from a paper design to a finished functional rocket. It took many years to get that far with the A4. And both the Germans and the Allied investigators would know it would take several years to go from a paper design to a working rocket for these larger versions. So if they were this concerned that larger versions were ready or almost ready, this was clearly much more than just a paper design. More from U.S. General Henry Arnold. So in a communication to Carl Spaatz during the war, 1944, he expresses concern. We must prevent these known large German rockets from ever causing damage to the U.S. So he was concerned that these large 75-ton rockets, these known 75-ton rockets, would land in England or the United States, and they must do everything to prevent that. Still more reports. Once U.S. forces invaded France, they started finding evidence of a lot of this in person, formerly German-occupied sites, and they found evidence for German rockets designed to carry a payload with a blast radius of 3 kilometers, 2 miles. So clearly some kind of nuclear weapon payload. This is from Colonel George Woods, who after the war went on, became Assistant Undersecretary of the Air Force. He says, yeah, all of us intelligence folks during the war knew about Germany's plans for the A9 armed with an atomic bomb destined for New York City. We knew that Germany had hoped to have that ready by the end of 1944. And they were only delayed, as long as they were, by all the Allied bombing and by the invasion of Normandy. More information from Donald Putt. It's well known how far these programs were, and it's a matter of conjecture just how soon Germany would have launched this massive strike with multiple nuclear weapons, multiple rockets, if the war had continued even just a few more days or weeks. Other information, this is from U.S. General Thomas Betts and from one of the chief British science advisors, Sir Reginald Patrick Linstead. So after the war, they were in charge of this Chios investigative committee that sent hundreds, thousands of investigators all over German territory looking at these programs. And then at the very end of the Chios investigation, these 2 leaders of Chios wrote their own final report for the Chios investigations. And so they say that their investigators on the ground have found conclusive evidence for versions of the A9 with a range of 2,400 miles, able to reach New York City. So this would be the A9, A10. They had found evidence for versions with greatly improved guidance systems with accuracy down to 150 feet, so much more accurate than most of the V2s that were launched against London, for example. They had found evidence that experiments had already been conducted on piloted models. So they not only built those piloted versions, they had launched those piloted versions. They had test launched them. Then of particular significance were the statements by high German experts that they planned to use these rockets to carry their atomic explosives. And even that some of the atomic explosives they had in mind had a mass of less than 1 ton. So they'd be talking about the smallest of the 3 nuclear designs, about 300 kilograms or so. So it's interesting that, all these people in the know would make these statements, all these generals, all these leading political figures. They're not just making stuff up in public. They're speaking based on detailed, very confident information that they have. And yet we don't have those detailed reports. Those detailed reports must exist, but they are still buried and classified someplace in the archives. Here's yet another general speaking up. This is General William Richardson, who was in charge of Army Air Force's guided missiles after the war. And he says, yeah, during the war, the Germans were working on the A9, A10 rocket to strike the United States. And we have evidence that they planned to put their atomic warhead on top of it. So this general has evidence. He was confident enough to say that to the press in 1947. But we don't have his evidence. His evidence is still classified and missing. Still more evidence. This is part of a train log, so a logbook of shipments arriving by train in Austria in 1944 and 1945. And what's interesting is that many of these shipments were received by the German SS General Hans Kammler. And in the later years of the war, he came to control virtually all of these very advanced weapons programs in Germany, both the rockets and the nuclear weapons. So he was personally signing for shipments he received. And among the shipments he received was a shipment of 18-meter-long machines. Now, I don't think these are 18-meter-long bulldozers or anything he was signing for. I think these were 18-meter-long rockets. These were extended A4 rockets or A9 rockets he was signing for. And we don't have to wonder about this. We know what he was signing for. At least somebody knows what he was signing for. Because officially he died at the end of the war in early May 45. And yet we have a number of rediscovered U.S. archival documents indicating that, even many, many months after the war, he was alive and well and in U.S. custody and singing like a canary. So somebody, someplace in U.S. archives has all of his post-war interrogations, reports, describing exactly what these 18-meter-long machines were, exactly what the German nuclear weapons were. Likewise, Werner von Braun, who was the chief designer for these rockets, would have been in a position to know. And he talked about the very special 6-ton payload he had in mind for his rockets. And so it's interesting when you go looking at the U.S. National Archive for Werner von Braun's paperclip file, there are detailed paperclip files on many, many hundreds of other German scientists and engineers who came to the United States after the war. But if you look in these files, look in their directory for Werner von Braun, he's missing. There is no paperclip file for Werner von Braun, our very most famous paperclip scientist. And he must have a paperclip file. And yet it is not at NARA, or at least it's not listed at NARA. They even have his brother here, Magnus von Braun, but they don't have him. So he must have a paperclip file. It must make for very juicy reading. But it is not available to the public. Other examples of withheld documents. On the left is a document from the U.S. Air Force Archive. This is a cover letter talking about a report by captured German rocket engineers describing their work on, quote, large-sized rockets and applications for large-sized rockets. Gee, what can you do with a large-sized rocket? So here's the cover letter. But we don't have the report. The report is still classified and withheld. Here on the right, this is a card catalog. And this card catalog has index cards for reports, including a report written in 1947, so a couple of years after the war. It's written by the CIG, which was kind of an intermediate state between the wartime OSS and the post-war CIA. And it is the complete history of German transatlantic rocket A-10, classified top secret. So it exists. We have the card catalog entry for it, but we don't have the report itself. And man, that would make one heck of a coffee table book if you could actually find that thing. Still more information. There's so many withdrawal slips and things for these reports, so we know that these reports exist. But when you go to request the report, the NARA people will hand you something saying, no soup for you, access restricted, this document has been withdrawn. So if these programs didn't exist, why are there all these reports about the programs? And why are the reports still classified here 80 years later? There must be something really interesting in those reports. So to summarize this portion of the presentation, there's a lot more to learn about exactly how far the German engineers got during the war. But what we do know is that the German engineers and their technology then after the war came to the United States and of course developed their technology all the way to the Saturn V. So here's Werner von Braun and his buddies. And a separate group of German engineers were captured by the Soviet Union and went on and produced the missiles and the space rockets for the Soviet Union. And there were some who were captured by the UK, and produced the post-war rocket and missile programs for the UK. And there were a bunch who are less well known publicly, but they were captured by the French and produced the post-war French rockets and missiles. Here's Karl-Heinz Bringer, for example. So this became the modern French and European Ariane rockets. And so there's more to be learned not only about the wartime programs, but there's more to be learned about exactly what contributions were made after the war by these people. Some of this is not as publicly known as it should be. So in addition to the liquid propellant missiles, there were also liquid propellant space planes. So let's talk about those. You've already seen the winged A9. This was even better. This was called the Silverbird, or Silbervogel in German, suborbital bomber. Very nice, catchy name. And they started working on this in 1933, very seriously, and continued all the way up to the very end of the war in 45. This was the brainchild of kind of the Austrian version of Werner von Braun, named Eugen Singer, and his wife, or later wife, Irene Brett. And so they designed what is basically a mini space shuttle. This would carry a pilot to guide it. It would carry a payload, and it would be launched from Germany. And they were showing that these things could go potentially any place on the planet, drop their payload off any place on the planet. Just like the A9 had the A10 for a first stage, this would be launched by a first stage, except the first stage was actually a rocket sled. So a very large rocket designed as a sled type contraption on rails. And that first stage would stay on the rails and use up all of its propellant and give a very large boost to this mini space shuttle, which would be the second stage, and then had its own engine that would carry it up into space. So if you read the books, this is mentioned quite a bit in various history books and space books, but everybody says, oh, this was just a paper design. This was clearly so crazy. It was just a paper design. They could never do this. They could never get permission to do this. Purely a paper design. If it was purely a paper design, why do we have a photograph of its rocket engine? This is a photograph from the Deutsches Museum of this 100-ton thrust Silbervogel rocket engine in 1941, 4 years before the war ended. How far did they get by 1945? And we have reports from post-war investigators, in this case Canadian investigators, who went to tour all the German rocket facilities after the war and said how impressed they were to see a rocket motor that was 10 times larger than the standard V2 or A4 rocket motor. That sounds like this thing. So they were making these giant rocket engines for something like the Silbervogel, the Silverbird. Still more reports. And again, once France was invaded by the Allies, they started finding more and more information about what Germany was building there on occupied territory, including this giant launch ramp, these rails I described. These were intended, according to the French people who are around, to launch these winged rockets and strike the United States. So intended to launch the Silbervogel. They're actually building the launch site, building the rails. And moreover, they added, the Germans had very helpfully told them, by the way, when we launch this thing, make sure you stand back 6 miles in case it accidentally detonates on the launch pad. So it was carrying a weapon with a blast radius of 6 miles. That is much more than a standard fission bomb. That is an H-bomb blast radius corresponding to the 6-ton bomb. So they were planning to launch the 6-ton bomb. They were working on the 6-ton bomb. They were building the launch ramps. They were building the engines for this thing. And according to multiple sources, they were actually building the Silbervogel. So from reporters, again, Colonel, later General Donald Putt, they were building it. And so Putt, who led many Allied investigators after the war, captured many of these German engineers, was definitely in a position to know. And he wrote in a journal that the Germans had built a test version of this that carried one man and had landing gear, and test runs were made on the engine. And Putt was left wondering if they'd maybe even test launched this thing. He wasn't sure whether or not they'd actually test launched this thing, but they had built this. More information on that 6-ton bomb. This is from the designers themselves of that rocket, so Eugen Zenger and Irena Brett. And so they wrote up a report with their calculations showing how their winged gizmo could be used for an attack on New York with a bomb load of 6 tons. Now, they were Austrian. They were doing a lot of this work in Austria. Here is another document from Austrian scientists. There was a very large Austrian group that was developing nuclear weapons during the war. It was led by a professor named Georg Stetter. So this is from someone who was very well acquainted with Stetter and the other people in his research group. And so after the war, he wrote, it'd be really quite a shame if somebody were to set off a 6-ton bomb that has lithium hydride or lithium deuteride fusion fuel and has a fission bomb with uranium or plutonium to light the fusion fuel. It'd be quite a shame if somebody were to set off a 6-ton bomb like that overhead over some country. So gee, what could they have had in mind for their 6-ton payload here?
Todd, that's amazing. That describes exactly what eventually became the thermonuclear weapons.
Yes, exactly. And indeed, there are a number of documents from the war or from investigators immediately after the war describing wartime German work on nuclear weapons using lithium hydride or lithium deuteride. Of course, after the war, Oak Ridge shifted and started doing isotope separation of lithium for lithium deuteride, just like that. In fact, there are documents during the war about German isotope separation of lithium during the war. They were separating lithium-6 and lithium-7 during the war. So this was much more than just paper design. They had a very serious H-bomb program. And according to multiple sources, they got within perhaps several months of actually testing their H-bomb. So they were doing exactly what Oak Ridge, what so many people in the United States and the Soviet Union did after the war. But the US and the Soviet Union perfected that in the 1950s. And here was Germany on the verge of perfecting it in 1945. And of course, the US and the Soviet Union didn't have methods of delivering those H-bombs until the 1950s. But here is Germany, perfecting or on the verge of perfecting delivery methods during the war. Even these 2-man rockets, even a 2-man spacecraft to carry this thing.
That's amazing. And is there evidence? You mentioned the lithium work. Is there evidence of where that was being done?
That is
about the uranium and plutonium. Evidence of that separation?
Yeah, that is a great question. There are a number of post-war Allied reports, investigating all these sites. And Germany was mass producing lithium. I mean, they were making thousands of tons of lithium during the war. And of course, some of that could be for non-nuclear applications, but it's available for nuclear applications as well. There are reports from the scientists who perfected their isotope separation method for the lithium, perfected a method of separating lithium-6 and lithium-7. And it's not clear if they actually scaled that up or not. And then for the production, so, it's lithium deuterides. You need the deuterium as well. And deuterium, a part of heavy water, as everybody knows, was being produced in Norway at a site called Everybody's familiar with that one. Everybody's seen the movie. What people are not familiar with is that there were over 24 other sites that were mass producing deuterium, mass producing heavy war. So all over German-occupied Europe, they had, according to my current count, about 27 or 28 plants making deuterium. And so they were mass producing deuterium, they were mass producing lithium. Then for the uranium-235 or the plutonium, I have a lot of documents, hundreds of pages of documents about that. So rather than building one Oak Ridge, and Oak Ridge is an amazing facility, but if Germany had tried to build one Oak Ridge, then they might as well paint a giant bullseye on it. There'd be Allied bombers overhead, and that'd be the end of the German Oak Ridge. So with all of the late wartime production, Germany did, their production of this, their production of that, not in one central place that could be bombed, but they distributed it. They did, part of it here, part of it there, part of it there. And many of those sites were underground, practically invulnerable to the types of bombs they had. So most of their wartime production was distributed and underground. And one would certainly expect them to do that with something very sensitive like a nuclear program.
Right, I agree. Well, we're going to have to transition here, and I'm thinking now that you need some more time to even finish this segment up, and we'll do that on the next time. But I have one specific question before we leave,
Sure.
a lithium issue, and that is, is there any evidence that they use mercury in separating that lithium?
That is a good question. They were using mercury for other applications. I know that Oak Ridge used mercury for its lithium separation. And the method that I mentioned, so the known wartime German method of separating was electrolysis in salts.
Oh,
It did not use
yeah.
mercury. But they may have had a separate mercury process for it. So it's an open question.
Yeah, I understand. I do. And again, I apologize for having to ask you to cut this out
Sure.
at this point, but we're just running completely out of time.
Certainly.
Would it be best if we come back on the next time, if you sort of brought us up to here and finished this one out and then went on into the other part?
Certainly, we can do that. But just to summarize this, there are so many different sources of evidence, all telling a part of the same story. And this is not in the conventional history books, but it is there in the archives. And so I'm hoping to encourage other people to go digging in the archives, find even more than I have. And for folks living in Europe, maybe even go digging in the ground very, very carefully, and look for evidence for some of this stuff.
Right.
Outstanding. Thank you so much. Yes.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. Ray, well, who do we have next time?
Well, on our schedule, we've got Natasha Benjamin coming. We've had her before, and we'll find out what she's up to and have her. And then we're going to bring Todd back and let him finish what he started here, and then go into the next larger segment that he has of talking more about the German program. So, Todd, we really appreciate having you with us today, and look forward to continuing this in the coming weeks.
Well, thank you very much.
All right. Very good. All right, folks. Thanks for watching, and we'll be back in a couple of weeks with a new Hidden History.
I'm Ray Smith, co-host with Keith McDaniel, and Keith's not able to be with us today. But we've got Todd Rider here again, and he's going to be talking about the forgotten creators of the German nuclear triad. And this is part 2 of the presentation that he made for us a little bit earlier. So, Todd, go right ahead.
Well, thank you very much for having me back. And my slides are visible now, right?
Yes, they are.
Okay. Please jump in anytime if you have any questions or suggestions along the way. And last time we started talking about the nuclear triad, the notion of having 3 different ways to deliver weapons of mass destruction. And people think of this as a post-World War II Cold War concept developed by the Soviet Union and the US. But there's a lot of evidence we're discussing that this was actually developed during World War II by Germany. So last time we mostly talked about land-launched intercontinental ballistic missiles that were under development in Germany during the war. We'll finish that discussion this time and then get into sub-launched missiles and intercontinental jet bombers. Last time we talked about liquid propellant rockets that Germany was developing, and let's briefly mention the solid propellant rockets as well. Now, there had been solid propellants around since ancient China, but those solid propellants had their limitations, and by about 1943, German engineers had pushed those solid propellants to their limits, building rockets like the Rheintochter and the larger Rheinboote. The Rheinboote at the lower right here had approximately the same range as a V2, but it was a much smaller rocket with a much smaller payload. And Germany really wasn't able to push that particular, old solid propellant rocket method much further than this. So there were several different German and Austrian engineers and chemists who developed improved solid propellant rockets. And this was called ammonium perchlorate composite propellant. And we still use these nowadays. Most large solid propellant rockets used for ICBMs and sub-launch missiles and used for launching satellites into space and boosters. These still use this propellant that was developed by these and other German and Austrian scientists. And after the war, these folks were interrogated by the United States and by other countries. And actually, most of the key people here went to work for France after the war, developing French post-war missiles. During the war, they were not only developing the propellant, they were developing up to very large size rockets to use it. Here was one described in post-war Allied reports. During the war, they were developing something called the V101, described as a solid propellant rocket that was 30 meters tall, so about 100 feet tall, basically like a wartime version of a Minuteman ICBM or something. Yeah, it's unclear just how far they got. Unfortunately, most of the reports on this are still classified and unavailable. As I mentioned, these folks were interrogated after the war. Many of them went to France, but before they did, they were interrogated by Americans, among others. And in particular, Fritz Zwicky was Swiss. He was a German-speaking scientist himself, but he was working for the Americans during the war. And he interrogated many of these people at the end of the war, and then brought their solid propellant rocket technology back to the United States to Aerojet, a company for which he was consulting, and to the U.S. War Department. So here's evidence of transfer of these technologies. Here's additional evidence of transfer of these technologies. Donald Putt was a colonel, later a general in the U.S. Army Air Forces, and he was one of the folks in charge of rounding up German-speaking scientists and bringing them back to the United States as part of Paperclip. And so he wrote this memo discussing some of the German rocket scientists he'd rounded up and said they were available to help the U.S. And that, based on the scientists, based on all the documentation he'd found, they were far ahead of the United States in their solid propellant rockets. Here's another example. This is Karl Klager. And after the war, he was brought to the United States and proceeded to invent all kinds of important things used for sub-launch missiles and solid propellant missiles. So it appears that these German solid propellant rocket technologies were incorporated after the war into the first large U.S. solid propellant rockets, like the U.S. Navy's Polaris, the Army's Pershing, and the Air Force's Minuteman missiles. Now let's move on and talk about submarine launch missiles, which may or may not be solid propellant. And let's start with cruise missiles. One of the world's first cruise missiles was the German V1, and this was first successfully flown in 1942, and then they built thousands of these during the war. And it was launched on a rail like this. Now, the V1 itself is fairly well known. What is less well known are the modifications of the V1 that were also developed during the war. And so here's a post-war Allied report on some of these modifications. They developed V1s that could be piloted, so not just sent on automatic control, but with a pilot, possibly a suicide pilot, to deliver it to its target. There were versions of the V1 that were launched not on a rail from the ground, but rather launched from under the wing of a large aircraft. So an aircraft could carry one or potentially several of these near a target and then launch them at the target. And there were even versions, this report describes, that were designed to be launched from submarines. Here is more information. This is from a highly placed German involved in these programs named Edmund Zorg. He was interrogated by the British after the war, by Edmund Tilley, one of the very top German-speaking British interrogators. And so this is from the British National Archives. And Zorg described development during the war of an improved manned V1 specifically to deliver an atomic bomb to its target. Here is further information on the interrogations of Zorg. He gave quite a bit of information about this nuclear-armed V1. And then independently, we have this document on the right. Hans Kammler was a general in the SS, and by the end of the war, he controlled virtually all these secret weapons. And one of his final public orders, before he vanished into U.S. custody, was ordering immediately blow up the V1s near Berlin. Now, there were thousands of these V1s all over German-controlled Europe. They weren't anything special, but these were very, very special V1s. And he wanted them destroyed before Soviet forces entered Berlin. So they may well have been modified to carry nuclear payloads or other weapons of mass destruction. As I mentioned, these things could be launched from submarines. And so here is a report, and this is from 1944 to the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the United States, discussing German submarines that have been modified to launch V1s from the deck, and these submarines could surface off the U.S. East Coast and target U.S. cities. Now, this is just a sketch, but this is a sketch by the Allies based on surveillance photos they'd taken. So as of September 1944, the Allies had actual photographs of German submarines that have been modified to carry V1s. Moreover, here is a bunch of evidence, many different communications from people, everyone from Dwight Eisenhower to Herbert Hoover, from late 1944 into early 1945, discussing very real German plans to send V1s capable of launching, to send submarines capable of launching V1s, perhaps nuclear armed, and to launch them at New York and other major U.S. cities. It's unclear exactly why these plans didn't come to fruition, whether it was due to Allied bombing of German targets, or whether they tried and failed, or sabotage, or what was going on. Then after the war, the U.S., after a couple of years, proudly displayed its brand new, all U.S. developed technology, which was a cruise missile capable of being launched from U.S. submarines. And it just happens to look exactly like a carbon copy of a German wartime V1. This is called the Loon in the U.S., and just happens to be launched from a U.S. submarine exactly like the wartime plans. But it was a very proud all-American invention as of 1947. There were other proud all-American inventions. They continued to develop cruise missiles, improving the technology up to the cruise missiles we have today. But if you peer under the rug, you find that all the dust bunnies under the rug all speak German. So here are lots of German and Austrian scientists and engineers working hard in the US to develop these cruise missiles. Let's move on to sub-launch ballistic missiles, not cruise missiles. And here were launches as early as 1942 of rockets from a submarine that was underwater. So this almost looks like the modern launch of a Polaris or Trident missile or something, but this was a smaller missile launched from a submarine underwater in 1942. This was done in collaboration with engineers from Peenemünde, the rocket base. And once they had demonstrated this with small rockets, they started doing it with larger and larger rockets. And there was enough Allied surveillance and bombing on the Baltic coast that they switched over to Austria, a large lake in the middle of nowhere in Austria. And they were building larger and larger sub-launch missiles and demonstrating them in Austria. Then the ultimate would be if you could deliver a sub-launched V2 or A4 rocket, a very large rocket with a fairly large payload. Now, that type of rocket is too large to fit into any of the wartime submarines that they had. So they developed a solution. A German submarine would tow a submarine trailer, and this trailer would initially be horizontal, be towed across the Atlantic, and the trailer would contain one of these V2 or A4 rockets. And then once they got off the coast of their target, they would flood one end of this trailer, that end would sink. Now the rocket would be upright, they'd open the doors and launch it. If you read the history books, officially this was purely a paper design, never got anywhere, never seriously contemplated. But here is documentation from one of the modern German U-boat museums saying that, oh yeah, during the war in 1944, they actually built these things, and they were successfully doing trials to see how well a submarine could tow these things. So it was actually built. Here is additional evidence. This is from the French, who were also investigating German technologies after the war. So a French investigator after the war wrote about some of his discoveries, what the Germans had been doing during the war, including a submarine capable of launching V2s. It was actually built, and that the Germans planned to use that to get off the coast and to bomb American cities, including Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Charleston. And that they planned to do this with atomic bombs. These amphibious V2s would carry atomic bombs. They planned to do this in conjunction with launching rockets from Europe at the United States. And according to this French investigator, Germany would have done this beginning in June 1945 if the war had not ended just when it did. There were other submarine technologies that were developed in Germany that were very critical. And prior to World War II, even in the early part of World War II, submarines had to be powered almost constantly by a diesel engine, which of course needed air, which meant they really couldn't submerge too far for too long. But that changed with the development of the so-called Type 21 U-boat. This U-boat was kind of like a giant Tesla. It had a huge number of batteries in the bottom of it, and so it could turn its diesel engine off after having charged these batteries, and then cruise around for quite a while underwater on battery power. Several of these Type 21s were captured by different nations at the end of the war and became the basis for a lot of post-war submarines in other countries. Another feature was that if your submarine is going to go cruising around underwater most of the time at fairly high speeds, then it needs to have a rounded front. Previously, submarines had a front kind of like the front of a ship, because submarines had spent a lot of time on the surface, just like a normal ship. But for submarines going mainly underwater, mainly at high speeds, they needed a more rounded front. And there were several German prototype submarines that had this rounded front during the war. And this rounded front was incorporated into post-war submarines in the US and other countries. Excuse me. Then sonar, of course, you need sonar for submarines. And we think of this as a wartime World War II invention, possibly allied. No, here are some of the very first patents on sonar. This is from Germans and patented in 1912, so even before World War I. And then over the next several decades, sonar was developed, perfected by several different German companies, and was quite sophisticated in World War II. And these technologies, a lot of them were taken in by the Allies after the war. Not only sonar, but anti-sonar, the ability to dampen or diminish sonar returns from your vessel. This was a special coating that had been developed by German engineers and chemists. So special rubberized coating that was actually put on at least one large submarine and greatly reduced the sonar cross-section. Then on top of the submarines, the ability to launch missiles directly from submarines. And this was also transferred to the United States and other countries and fully utilized after the war. Here is the Polaris, the first major sub-launched missile in the United States after the war. And here is one of the proud inventors, Willy Fiedler. Doesn't sound very American. Here are all of his patents. I've already mentioned Carl Clogger, who was up to his ears in all this post-war development in the United States. And again, pick up the rug, and all of the dust bunnies speak German. Oodles and oodles of German and Austrian scientists and engineers involved in all aspects of these programs, contrary to what you read in the official history books. The same thing was true in the Soviet Union. After the war, the Soviets wanted to develop sub-launched missiles, and rather than starting from scratch, they simply used German technologies. So here is the first post-war Soviet sub-launched missile. It just happens to be a carbon copy of a wartime German missile that was kind of a smaller scale V2 type rocket called Wasserfall. And it just happens to be launched from a Soviet sub that was actually a carbon copy of the wartime German Type 21 U-boat we already saw. There were other relevant technologies as well. You'd like to be able to communicate with your submarine missile fleet, wherever it is, even submerged, even on the far side of the planet. And sonar signals only travel so far. And radio signals really don't penetrate water terribly well. But extremely long wavelength radio signals will. So during the war, Germany built huge transmitters. This was one that covered like many square miles, and it was called Goliath, and it transmitted on extremely low radio frequencies that would pass through the earth and pass through water, and so they could communicate with their U-boats wherever they were. Then after the war, these technologies were taken to the U.S. and to the Soviet Union. Here is a comparable U.S. facility, Clam Lake, built in Wisconsin 40 years after the German version. Now let's talk about intercontinental jet bombers, the third part of the nuclear triad. And there are a number of well-known aircraft that were built in Germany, mass-produced in Germany during the war, that would have been capable of carrying the German nuclear weapons we talked about last time. And from all the archival documentation, there appear to have been at least 3 major types of German nuclear weapons. A small one that weighed about 300 kilograms, and there were many aircraft that could carry that. A medium one that weighed about 2 tons. There were aircraft that could carry that. And under development, almost ready by the end of the war, was a full-fledged German H-bomb that weighed 6 tons and would have had a megaton yield. So for all these cases, there are known German aircraft that could have carried these bombs. Most of them had a range, on the order of 1,000 kilometers or so. So these were not going to get to the United States in return, but they could certainly deliver these bombs to the UK or to Soviet targets. And then there were a couple with the range to just barely reach the US. But there were more advanced bombers under development. Here is evidence that there was more advanced stuff under development. This is a photo from the US National Archives, and it shows in 1948 a wartime German bomb that was found by Allied investigators and delivered to the United States for further study after the war. This bomb was designed to be airdropped, and this bomb weighed 16 tons. Now, you don't go building 16-ton bombs to be airdropped unless you have or are building aircraft capable of carrying 16-ton bombs. So exactly what aircraft did they have capable of carrying this thing? Here is a small example of an aircraft, a prototype aircraft. This is a flying wing. This was famously developed by the Horton brothers and kind of a prototype stealth fighter, if you will. So we know that these small versions were built, but there's evidence that larger versions may have been built as well. After the war, some German engineers were talking to the Allied investigators. The Germans were unemployed. They were desperate for work, and they were trying to get work. So the Germans told the Allied investigators that for simply paying them room and board, the Germans were prepared to very rapidly go to work building for the United States an aircraft with a 14,000-kilometer round trip range and 6 jet engines and a flying wing, which they drew here. And if you squint and look at this diagram very closely, I think you can see Captain America hanging on right here. But anyway, if these German engineers were prepared to immediately start building this for the US after the war, it raises the question of exactly what they were doing during the war and exactly what they built during the war. Here is further evidence. This is a cable from Alan Dulles, sort of one of the resident spooks in Europe during the war. And he reports that Germany has developed, as of 1943, 1944, Germany has developed long-range bombers capable of reaching distant targets, delivering weapons of mass destruction, and that these long-range bombers were closely associated with an area south of Hamburg called Lüneburger Heide. This appears to have been one of the major German nuclear development sites. Here is another document. This is from a prisoner of war who was captured and reported that he had actually seen prototype aircraft developed and demonstrated during the war. Other reports after the war, Allied investigators in different parts of formerly German-controlled Europe found, prototype bombers here, prototype bombers there. These were different locations in Europe. These were different designs for bombers. So there were parallel programs developing these intercontinental bombers, and they reached the prototype or possibly even mass production phase. One of the most dramatic examples is from Norway. Norway was controlled by Germany throughout most of the war. And during the war, the Germans built extremely large airfields around Oslo, mysteriously large airfields. This was observed by Allied intelligence. And then at the end of the war, according to these reports in the Washington Post, Stars and Stripes, other sources, at the end of the war, Allied investigators found 40 bombers on these airfields in Norway. These were 40 large bombers capable of reaching the United States. They were a brand new design from Heinkel, something unlike the previous designs, and designed to carry weapons of mass destruction. And they were, quote, held in readiness for missions to New York, and then captured at the end of the war. Here's additional evidence for those airfields and those bombers. This is a prisoner of war who was captured and interrogated by the Allies. And the Allies tried everything they could to poke holes in his story. They never could. His story was that during the war, he had received special training to supervise bombs of chemical weapons. And then once he'd been trained, he was sent back to Norway and put in charge of overseeing stockpiles of these chemical bombs at Norway on the airfields. And the specific chemical weapon he describes sounds like chlorine trifluoride. And it is an extremely nasty chemical weapon. It will basically dissolve almost anything, basically eat almost anything. So human flesh, clothing, metal, almost anything. And according to him, the Germans had mass-produced this weapon, stockpiled bombs of this, and these bombs were at the airfields in Norway, all ready to attack Allied targets. Now, those large bombers in Norway were said to be 40 bombers of a special new type developed by the Heinkel Aircraft Company. Here is Ernst Haeckel, who ran the company, and here was his lead aircraft designer, Siegfried Günther. And here are some of Günther's designs showing these giant flying wing bombers. Now, officially, these were just purely paper designs, never built. But if you read the information from Heinkel after the war, if you read other documentation, it sounds as if perhaps some of these were built during the war, all the way up to, quote, a 60-ton flying wing bomber with a range of 28,000 kilometers, so easily able to reach the United States and return. And after the war, these German engineers were interrogated by Allied investigators. And then once Allied investigators had learned everything they could from them, then they didn't hire these Germans. They just kind of left them to rot. I think most of them ended up going to the Soviet Union. Now, to get a bomber across the Atlantic and ideally return, you need a fairly good aircraft engine for that, something fairly fuel efficient. And most of the engines up to that point in time had been old-fashioned piston propellers. Those would not have a terribly long range. You can calculate the range for these things just from simple equations using the relative lift of the aircraft, the drag of the aircraft, and the mass ratio of the aircraft, how much of the initial aircraft weight is propellant versus how much is aircraft hardware and people. So a piston propeller using about 40% of its initial load as fuel, it's fairly good, probably the best you can achieve, would have a maximum range of a little over 6,000 kilometers. So maybe it could reach across the Atlantic. It certainly couldn't return. The first jet engines at that time were called turbojets, and they had just slightly longer range, still not enough to go to the US and return. What you really want is a turbofan or a turboprop engine. Of course, we use turbofans on most passenger aircraft nowadays, and that is much more fuel efficient and would have a range up to 15,000 kilometers, easily able to cross the Atlantic and return. And a turboprop is still used on a number of commercial aircraft, and that would have a roughly comparable range, about 18,000 kilometers or so. So if we could find those 40 prototype bombers in Norway, we may well find the first 80 production line turbofan or turboprop engines. And we actually know where those engines may have come from. This was Carl Leist. During the war, he was developing and building and testing turbofan engines. So by 1943, he had demonstrated the world's first known turbofan engine. This was 1943, 2 years before the end of the war. Plenty of time to get these things into mass production. That was turbofans. Here are turboprops. And Ferdinand Bronder and several other people were developing and building turboprop engines during the war. This is the Junkers Umo version of this Junkers turboprop engine. Then after the war, these Junkers turboprop engines were used by the Soviet Union as the engines on their famous Tupolev 95 or Bear bombers. In fact, these are still in service. So these Russian bombers are flying 80 years later with these German-derived turboprop engines. Then there were many, many sources that reported after the war, very knowledgeable sources, that reported that if the war continued, even just another month or two, that Germany would have brought a lot of these weapons of mass destruction and these delivery methods into action and used them against Allied cities. So this is from a high-ranking U.S. official based on these reports. If the war had continued, the Germans would have smashed New York City with improved rockets. and they would have reached Washington, D.C. with jet-propelled intercontinental bombers. So he gave this testimony to the U.S. Congress. Likewise, the Convair Aircraft Company wrote after the war, based on their investigations on the ground in Germany, that Germans were prepared to launch rockets and, quote, destroy New York City and other American cities within a matter of months, and that they had also completed jet-propelled heavy bombers to drop bombs on Allied targets. This is from General George Marshall, reporting that German technological advances, such as the development of atomic explosives, made it imperative that we attack and end the war when we did, and that by the end of the war, Allied cities, U.S. cities, had come within range of German technologies to deliver these weapons. More reports. This is from Werner Vector, a fairly highly placed German official. He was captured by the Soviets and interrogated by the Soviet NKVD, the KGB, after the war. And he described both long-range rockets capable of carrying atomic bombs and long-range bombers capable of carrying atomic bombs. He says that all this was built, and this would have been used, again, just within a matter of months if the war had continued. Then on top of those wartime technologies, a lot of this was developed and transferred after the war, and that included advanced radar technologies. We think, if you read the history books, we think of radar as being a wartime World War II British invention. Here is the first known radar system developed, invented by a German in 1903. So well before World War I, let alone World War II. And then a series of Germans who improved the radar systems here, gave them higher powers, longer range, along with anti-radar technologies, the ability to reduce a radar cross-section. So there were several different German scientists and engineers, and Austrian scientists and engineers, who were developing radar-absorbing coatings. These were actually installed on some submarines to prevent the submarines from being detected by radar. And they're developing these coatings for aircraft as well. So these technologies were transferred to the United States after the war and became the basis for later stealth aircraft programs. There were so many different examples of German scientists and German technologies that were transferred. Here's Hans Multop and his designs that led to post-war American aircraft. Alexander Lippisch, who seems to have had a large effect on post-war American aircraft. And we really need more historical research into the archives, into the company records, to find out exactly how these technologies were transferred from Germany and how they were used in the US and other countries. That was the US. Here's the UK. These were German-speaking aerodynamicists who were taken to the UK after the war and helped to develop very advanced aircraft that the British had after the war, like the Avro Vulcan here. Again, notice the flying wing type design, and even the Concorde here, which they developed. So to summarize all this, we've talked about the German nuclear payloads and the three different methods of delivering those, the land-launched missiles, sub-launched missiles, and intercontinental jet bombers. And it's clear from the evidence I've shown from the archives that all of these technologies were advanced to a very great degree during the war, much more advanced than you'd read in standard history books. But we really need more research in archives and in the field to find out exactly how far these technologies got during the war, and perhaps more importantly, to find out exactly how much these wartime German technologies influenced more famous post-war programs in the US and Soviet Union, France, UK, and other countries. So I'd strongly encourage anybody who's interested to first look at the documents I've found, and they're online on my website, and then use those and go digging into any archives you can and see what additional information you can find. All right, I'll stop there. Do you have any questions?
No, thank you very much for presenting that to us. I think there's a lot of information provided there. And I would, along with you, encourage anyone that has some additional information or can do some additional research to begin by contacting you through your website and continue to follow this as long as there's information being brought up. What are you looking at now? What's your future plans?
I'm hoping to go back to the archives and do a little more digging. And I've heard from a couple of people who are digging through archives. So we're trying to find more information about these various programs. And one thing that interests me is not just these technologies, but rather the system behind them. What was it that enabled there to be so many revolutionary innovations coming out of this fairly small region, this fairly small period of time? So what factors generally promoted scientific innovation? And those can be transferred and used even now. How could we encourage modern universities and research systems to support revolutionary innovation as much as possible?
You might also mention that you're providing some webinars that people can participate in. You've done a couple of them. I think you've got another one scheduled. You want to mention those?
Oh, yes, thank you. Yes, I periodically do these presentations by Zoom with a live studio audience. So if you'd like to be in the live studio audience remotely online, well, please contact me via my website there, send me an email, and I'll put you on the list. But it's kind of a loose collaboration of archival researchers everywhere from California to the Balkans, all investigating different aspects of this.
And remind our viewers what your website link is.
Sure. So it's up here, riderinstitute.org.
Yeah, there you go. riderinstitute.org, and then just send Todd an email and he will give you the links to the upcoming programs that he presents. Anything else, Todd?
No, I think that'll do it. I really appreciate your having me back.
Glad to do it. It's been a good run. I think you've provided a lot of useful information. And folks, thanks very much for joining Hidden History, Stories from the Secret City. Welcome to Hidden History, Stories from the Secret City. I'm Ray Smith, co-host with Keith McDaniel, but Keith's not going to be here today. He's got some other things that he has to do. But I have a guest with me that you've seen before. Dr. Todd Rider is back to talk to us about forgotten creators of the German atomic bomb. Todd, I watched a program on YouTube last night that I had not seen before, and it had some of the very same information that you provided and found in your research. So it was on the done by the History Hits, I think's the name of the group that's doing it. But let's just get right into what you've got to share with us today, okay?
Sure. Thank you very much for inviting me back. And I'd like to give an overview of the wartime German atomic bomb program. This is an updated version with a number of new archival documents, including some that were actually declassified as recently as 2024.
Great. All right.
And this information comes from archives all around the world, US, European, even Australian archives. I have found some of this information, but many other people have also helped in finding this information. So I do strongly encourage anyone else who's interested to go digging and see what they can find. And I should also point out that everything here comes from entirely unclassified or declassified documents. Now, I know that I'm going to blow through all these documents, all this evidence at about warp 8, But people shouldn't be dismayed by that. So I encourage everyone to go to my website. The website address is here. And you can download all these slides and a whole lot more. There are extra deleted scenes. There's a special making of featurette you can see. So please download all that. And I'm going to blow through this. So the wartime German program, if you read most history books, the program was quite small and very primitive and never really got terribly far compared to the Manhattan Project. But it's been quite difficult for historians to really reconstruct the wartime German nuclear program for many factors. It was not just in one location, not even just in Germany proper, but it was spread all over German-controlled Europe. And on this map is a reminder of just how large the area was that Germany controlled during much of the war. So the program was scattered over that area, including even in several countries that were nominally neutral, but were helping Germany, including Sweden, Switzerland, Portugal, and Spain. The program was also divided among many different government agencies. So the German Army, the German Navy, Air Force, the SS, even the German Post Office, and many other groups. It was divided among many different companies, the chemical company IG Farben, the major electrical companies AEG and Siemens, various uranium-related companies, Degussa, Auer, Tribacher, and so forth. It was spread over many different research organizations, the Kaiser Wilhelm Institutes and universities all over the place. And it was also done in many underground facilities that were resistant to Allied bombing. So having the program set up like that made the German nuclear program much more resistant to Allied bombing and Allied intelligence, but it has unfortunately made it more resistant to modern historians trying to reconstruct all of this. There are other difficulties for historians. Toward the end of the war, the German forces destroyed or buried an awful lot of their work, an awful lot of their documents. And then what was found by many different organizations from many different countries, and then taken back to goodness knows where in all those different countries. And a lot of it is still classified here, even 80 years later. And then finally, simply, a lot of people are not terribly happy to rediscover all this. It tarnishes the modern public images of many of the countries involved, both Axis and Allied countries, as well as even neutral countries. So people don't really want to hear this terribly much, but I think it is very important history. Here is a recently rediscovered document. This is from a very top German nuclear scientist who came to the United States during the war. And this document ended up in Leslie Groves' files for the Manhattan Project. And according to this very highly placed scientist, no later than January 1938, the very top levels of the German military were actively recruiting scientists, even Jewish scientists, to develop nuclear weapons for Germany. And as shown by this and a number of other documents, the German military was in charge of the nuclear weapons program from sometime in the 1930s until about 1942. And then in 1942, control of the program seems to have passed to the SS, Heinrich Himmler and those guys. And for example, here is a post-war Allied interrogation report. They were interrogating one of Heinrich Himmler's top adjutants, top assistants. And according to his assistant, Heinrich Himmler in the SS had a panel of scientific advisors. And so he lists the panel of scientific advisors. There were 11 people. Of these 11 people, 6 of them were actually nuclear experts, and the other 5 were earth science experts with expertise quite relevant if you plan to go testing and deploying nuclear weapons. So it gives you some idea of what was on Himmler's mind. This is a memo from 1942. So, 1942, years before the end of the war. And this is a memo announcing an upcoming super secret meeting of Heinrich Himmler from the SS and Adolf Hitler and Wilhelm Ohnesorge, who led the nuclear program for the Reichspost, the post office. So these top people are going to get together in 1942 and discuss the latest German intelligence on exactly what the Manhattan Project is up to. Then from 1938 until the very end of the war, spring 45, Germany obtained literally thousands of tons of uranium ores and thorium ores from sites all across Europe, including these. And this is shown by a number of different sources. And I should point out that Germany had access to the same sort of very high quality Congolese ore that the US used in the early phases of the Manhattan Project that was stored in Belgium and removed by the Germans. Germany also had access to all of the East German and Eastern European uranium mines that later supplied most of the uranium for the post-war Soviet nuclear weapons program. So they had the same sort of uranium that the US did for the Manhattan Project. They had the same uranium mines that were used for the post-war Soviet nuclear weapons project. And they even had access to additional mines, such as in Portugal, which I believe were later used for the British nuclear project. So they had lots of uranium available to them. And then, according to these documents, that uranium was shipped by plane. It was so urgent it had to be sent by plane, not by train or by truck or something, but shipped directly by plane and to a number of different destinations. There were at least 20 different reported sites scattered all over German-controlled territory where uranium and thorium were processed. And these documents say that it was processed to uranium metal, it was processed to uranium hexafluoride, just as was used there at Oak Ridge to enrich uranium. And so processed to a variety of compounds with high throughput processes, all described here. And here's a description of just one of these facilities that has over 1,000 people working on processing uranium there, plus all these other facilities. So it's a very large operation to process the uranium. But of course, uranium also needs to be enriched. And there are several different methods to do that. According to the unclassified literature, the most energy efficient method to enrich uranium is centrifuges. And what most people don't realize is that gas centrifuges were invented in Germany sometime before 1895. It's mind-boggling, but before 1895, they invented gas centrifuges. And then by World War II, there were groups producing uranium gas centrifuges for isotope separation all over the place. There were at least 2 different groups in Kiel. There was a group in Munich mass-producing uranium gas centrifuges, one in Freiburg, one in Göttingen, one in Thuringia, one in Breslau, now called Wroclaw. Surprisingly, there were factories in Switzerland, nominally neutral Switzerland, that were mass-producing gas centrifuges and then exporting them back to Germany. So it's a very important question, just how many gas centrifuges total did Germany build during the war and then use during the war? That's just one method of enrichment. A different method is electromagnetic separation, called calutrons in the US. And these calutrons, of course, were widely used at Oak Ridge in the Y-12 facility, starting about 1944, 1945. Here is a German calutron. This was an actual photograph of a German prototype calutron built, tested, demonstrated in 1941. And this was designed and built by the German scientist Manfred von Ardenne. And here is a document from Leslie Grove's files in the Manhattan Project showing that after the war, Samuel Gaudschmidt, working for Leslie Groves, found multiple 1942 reports on these German calutrons. And I'd love to read those reports, but those reports are still classified and buried here 80 years later. Here's a report we do have. This was one of von Ardenne's associates.
Todd, excuse me.
Yeah.
Do you know where those documents are?
I have the cover letter here, but the actual reports mentioned in the cover letter are not with it, and there's not even so much as a withdrawal card. At U.S. National Archives, sometimes if a document is still classified, there's a card saying, yes, we have it, but no, you can't see it. There's not even so much as one of those cards available for this.
Oh, so there's nothing available. I'm going to be having lunch with Dick Groves, General Groves' grandson, and I'm going to share this information with him and see if he's even seen this document. So that's why I was asking.
Yes. Yes, please do. I've heard of him. I've never talked to him. I would love to talk to him. I probably have a number of Leslie Groves related documents that he's not seen, and I would hope that he has a lot of related documents that I've not seen. So I'd love to swap archival documents with him.
I'll make that connection. I'll talk to him when he's coming to Oak Ridge next week. So we'll have a conversation about you.
Great, thank you very much. Now, one report we do have is from one of Manfred von Ardenna's associates, Heinz Ewald, from March 1942. And this is a very detailed document where he does calculations for how to obtain the optimal performance from a calutron. And then from von Ardenna's own autobiography, we know that in 1941, after he demonstrated this prototype calutron, he went to German industry, with the backing of German government, trying to persuade some of the large German electrical companies to mass produce these calutrons. Now, in his autobiography, he's too coy to actually state what actually happened after that. But we have this report also from Leslie Groves' files. And this is an intelligence report stating that during the war, the Reichspost, for which von Ardenna had worked, had then built 3 new labs loaded with high voltage equipment for nuclear purposes, and they put von Ardenna and another top nuclear scientist, Siegfried Pflüger, in charge of it. So it sounds as if they built 3 different locations with calutrons. And then lending further support to that, this is from the U.S. Army Air Force's General Henry Arnold, who was in charge of bombing lots of German sites. And he wrote after the war that during the war, he had been assigned to go bomb various German sites that had, quote, electric machines that make it possible to complete the development of the atomic bomb. So that sounds like calutrons. So the U.S. forces had apparently bombed some of these known calutron sites. Now, these were not the only people in Germany making calutrons. There were other scientists, other groups making calutrons. So again, a very important question is how many of these uranium enrichment machines were produced in Germany and used in Germany during the war. And then there's a third method, there's gaseous diffusion, also used at Oak Ridge. So gaseous diffusion was actually invented by the Nobel Prize winning German scientist Gustav Hertz in 1923, so over 20 years before the end of the war. Here you see a gaseous diffusion cascade with multiple gaseous diffusion cells all lined up in series. And so this was the 1920s. Now, Gustav Hertz was of Jewish ancestry, and yet his work was deemed so important by the Third Reich that he was allowed to remain and work on this stuff throughout the war. And then after the war, he went to the Soviet Union and helped to build gaseous diffusion facilities for the Soviet Union after the war. He's not alone. There were a number of other Germans working on this, Erika Kramer, Erich Baga, and others. This is a patent from the German uranium company, Our Gesellschaft, and in 1940, they actually patented improved methods of doing diffusion enrichment. And then officially, we don't really know exactly what happened during the war. It's just a whole big blank in the history books and in the documents. But we know that at the end of the war, when Soviet forces marched into Eastern Germany, they found a German village called Neustadt an der Ola. And in this village were factories that were uniquely skilled at producing the nickel membrane filters that you need for a gaseous diffusion plant. And so these German factories supplied all the nickel membrane diffusion filters for the post-war Soviet program. So what exactly were these German factories doing during the war with that? We also know, again from Leslie Groves' own files, that during the war, the Manhattan Project here in 1944 stated in writing that they believed that the German gaseous diffusion program was actually ahead of where Oak Ridge was at the time. And then, well, after the war, in September 1946, a year and a half after the end of the war in Europe, Leslie Groves personally sent Percival Keith, who, as you know, was the chief designer of the Oak Ridge K-25, sent Percival Keith on a super secret 2-week mission to Czechoslovakia. Now, why would you send the person who designed Oak Ridge to possibly be captured by Czech security forces or by Soviet security forces unless there was something really urgent there that required his personal expertise. And so I think the best explanation for this is that there was probably a German isotope enrichment plant in Czechoslovakia, former German-controlled territory, and it was probably a gaseous diffusion plant, which is why they wanted Percival Keith there.
Now,
But all
back up to that, please. When is that? When does that letter?
this is from September 1946.
Now, September 46. So the war's over, been over a year.
Yes. And Czechoslovakia is in a strange political state. It is nominally independent, but the Soviets are exerting a lot of control over it. The U.S. doesn't have too much control, but from other documents, we know that the U.S. is actually smuggling people in and out of Czech territory and grabbing lots of goodness knows what German stuff from Czech territory and bringing it back to the United States.
Okay, all right, I understand. I just needed to get it in the time frame. I got it. Thank you.
But it's a very interesting document, but I can find nothing else about this. So I'd love to hear from anyone else who might, know about this, might have documents about this. But yeah, everything is so far still completely classified and buried. So those were the major enrichment methods. Now, in terms of where they would actually be set up, where the oak ridges were, obviously the Germans wouldn't want to build one big oak ridge. They might as well, put a giant target sign on the top of it for Allied bombers. So the practice would be to distribute their enrichment over a number of different sites. And especially to resist Allied bombing, they were building many underground sites. You'd expect that. And in fact, here is a report that is exactly what the Germans did. This is a high-level OSS report from October 1944. And this secret OSS agent was able to schmooze with a lot of high-level German industrialists. And they were happy to blab, oh yeah, we have lots of distributed underground factories that are doing uranium enrichment. Now, in this report for the OSS, it doesn't state where those factories were, but says that they were all spread around German-controlled territory. Fortunately, from other reports, we do know the locations or believed locations of many of those enrichment sites. This report, also from the OSS, states that there were two very large enrichment plants in eastern Czech territory, and these were large enough that each of these plants had 30,000 employees. So large-scale enrichment. There are also mentions of a plant with 30,000 employees in Thuringia in central Germany, and of a plant in Slovakian territory, of underground factories doing this in Landsberg in Germany that required so much power, they had a number of special power plants built to power them. There are reports of factories in Silesia and what's now Poland. Interestingly, there are reports of underground factories doing uranium enrichment south of Hamburg, and reports that these factories employed, hundreds or thousands of employees, making a very special new explosive with a blast radius of several kilometers. And this very special explosive was designed to go in a spherical bomb. Now, spherical bombs are not very aerodynamic, and so you only make a spherical bomb if the physics compels you to make it spherical. And I think you can probably think of one or two very special World War II bombs that were spherical.
Yeah.
And then other intelligence here. These are intelligence reports on a site in Austria called Radl-Zipf. And what's interesting about these reports is that they say that this site was taking in minerals, like thorium, uranium minerals, and that this site had 200 what sounds like either centrifuges or gaseous diffusion cells. And through these 200 centrifuges or whatever they were running a very corrosive gas. Now, I think you can probably think of a very corrosive gas that was used at Oak Ridge. And so it describes this very corrosive gas had to be handled. It was toxic, and it was corrosive to all metals except for a very shiny metal like nickel. Probably sounds rather familiar to Oak Ridge people there.
Yes.
So there's uranium enrichment in order to get uranium for a bomb, but of course you can also breed plutonium or possibly uranium-233, and that can be done in a reactor. Now, for reactors, people are most familiar with Werner Heisenberg's reactor, which started off in the Berlin suburb of Dahlem and was later moved to Haigerloch toward the end of the war. This reactor never went critical, and now it's a great tourist attraction. But you usually don't hear about all the other German reactors and all of the documents, all the evidence supporting these other reactors. So quite a number of these. And one in Königsberg that was bombed especially by the Royal Air Force. And it appears to have been a large Hanford-style breeder reactor setup. One that was reported in Krizik or Bodenbach in Czech territory, according to documents that were declassified just last year. And then a very special one here in Gusen, Austria. Let me show you this. So Gusen's kind of in the middle of nowhere in Austria, but here is a US aerial surveillance photo from just before the end of the war, March 1945. And it shows all the surrounding fields, shows that there's a large underground facility here. You can barely see signs of the tunnels, but as part of this large underground facility, there is this poking its nose out of the ground. And you see one or possibly two octagonal, what look like pool reactors, either under construction or operational, and adding evidence of German guilt here as Allied forces were approaching. So a month later, in April 45, here's an aerial surveillance photo of the same facility. Whatever this was, it was so important that before Allied troops got there, the Germans buried the whole thing. They filled it with earth and concrete. They buried the whole thing, and it remains buried and sealed to this day, 80 years later. But we do have a report from one of the companies involved in constructing this facility. And so in this report, they show what looks like these same sort of structures, and they label it 2 atomic piles. We also have this cover letter from post-war Allied investigations of this site, and they were so excited on the cover letter, they wrote underground pile with 3 underlines here. Now, I would love to read the report that went with this cover letter, but unfortunately, the report is still classified 80 years later. You can't read it. But we do have local train logs from 1944, 1945 in Austria, showing that this site in Austria by train received massive numbers of shipments from other suspected German nuclear sites, and that was delivered to known German people here at this site. And then here is an interview with the son of the SS commandant of the facility, saying, yes, this was part of a larger underground facility that actually had 30 to 40 kilometers of tunnels where they could process the material coming out of these reactors in order to construct the atomic bomb. Now, reactors are not the only way to breed plutonium or uranium-233. You can also do it with enough particle accelerators. This is called electronuclear breeding. The US had a large program in electronuclear breeding during the Cold War. And there's evidence that Germany did too during the war. Germany, for some reason, had a very high priority, very secret program to produce large numbers of particle accelerators all over German-controlled territory, everywhere from the Netherlands to Czech territory. And then there are multiple statements from people that they were using these particle accelerators in order to try to breed plutonium or uranium-233, and even statements that the Allies found out about this and bombed this program, trying to stop it. Then there's heavy water. And of course, everybody always hears about the Norwegian heavy water plant at Femork, and how it was very heroically destroyed by Kirk Douglas and Richard Harris. But it's odd that you never really hear about the other 26 or so German heavy water sites that were scattered all over Axis territory. There were at least 2 others in Norway. There was one in nominally neutral Sweden, shipping heavy water to Germany. There were these all over Europe. There were heavy water plants all the way down to southern Italy. But oddly, you never hear about these. But here is the documentation that these existed. So why was Germany producing heavy water at least 27 plants? despite their urgent wartime needs to be producing other things. It's just that the heavy water was very important, very urgently needed for breeder reactors or electronuclear breeders, or as fusion fuel or for other purposes. And if you go looking for more details in archives, you find, yes, we have lots of reports on these heavy water plants, and no, you cannot see them. Withdrawal notice, access restricted, withdrawal notice, access restricted, withdrawal notice, access restricted. 80 years later, you still cannot read the official reports on these wartime German heavy water plants. Then there were a number of other nuclear-related materials that were also produced in Germany. And for a nuclear program, as you know, you need other things like lithium, beryllium, boron, graphite, fluorine for the uranium hexafluoride, aluminum, calcium to help in purifying the uranium, nickel, zirconium, cadmium as a neutron absorber. And we know that during the war, Germany produced all these materials in quantities of thousands of tons. And we know this by post-war Allied reports, where Allied investigators went into these factories after the war and said, "Tell us, how much of this stuff you produced." It was thousands of tons. We even know that there were some sites, such as IG Farben's Bitterfeld facility, that were producing several of these nuclear-related materials all at the same site. That seems quite suspicious. And we know that since Germany was collaborating with Japan on a nuclear program, that we have shipments recorded where Germany was shipping by submarine to Japan at least 560 kilograms of uranium, which may have been enriched, but several of these materials along with it. They're also shipping, lithium and stuff along with it. And we know that after the war, these very same German plants continued to produce these very same materials in order to supply the post-war US nuclear weapons program and the post-war Soviet nuclear weapons program. So why were these plants producing these materials during the war? Who was their customer? We also can see documents about the required mass of fission fuel for a weapon. So the pit masses, the critical masses for a fission weapon. And we have a number of documents reporting that for an implosion design, which is the preferred German design in these documents, the required mass of purified uranium-235 or plutonium was in the range of a few kilograms. And in fact, these documents state not only did they know that mass, but state that they fabricated pits. So they made pits for nuclear weapons. They made several pits and reports the manufactured pit masses as being anywhere from 1 kilogram up to 8 kilograms. You can get a nice bang with 8 kilograms of uranium-235 or plutonium. Now, what designs would those go in? We have that information. In the archival documents, so far, I found evidence for 3 different sizes of German nuclear weapons. This was the smallest size. This bomb had a mass of around 300 kilograms total. Very small yield, less than a kiloton, but you really wouldn't want it to go off at your house. And this was apparently tested in 1944 and 1945. So here are versions of this design from 2 of the top German army scientists working on it, Erich Schumann and Walter Trinks. This was 2-point ignition, so this was not a spherically symmetric implosion bomb, but this was an implosion bomb imploded from both ends, so-called 2-point design, later used in more advanced nuclear weapons in the US after the war. Here is a post-war report from the US General Thomas Betts and the top British scientist Lansdale here, and they report that these smaller nuclear weapons were intended to be mounted on German rockets, like V-2 rockets, and launched. And here is a report from one of Heinrich Himmler's adjutants, Werner Grothmann, his other major adjutant, reporting that these bombs were actually made and that they had a size and shape roughly comparable to a standard German 250 kilogram bomb called an SC-250 bomb. So here's a standard SC-250 from US museums for comparison. So we should expect that if these things were built, they would look kind of like this bomb on the outside, but on the inside, they'd look like this with explosives, conventional explosives at both ends to squeeze, to compress, to implode, a core of fission fuel. And in Alsos documents, also from Leslie Grove's files, we have this. This is a report from a German who was captured by the Allies. And according to this German, in spring 1945, before he was captured, he saw a stockpile of very special bombs. And based on his experience seeing the outside, the inside of these very special bombs, he drew what he saw on this stockpile. And look at this, it is 2-point ignition with conventional explosives on both ends. And it has a pit here in the middle. And that pit is even surrounded by a heavy metal tamper in this. And he saw these things. He saw a stockpile of these bombs. That's the small version. Here's the medium-sized version. This had a mass of about 2,000 kilograms, 2 tons. This was spherical. It would have had a yield probably of tens of kilotons with a full load of fuel, and seems to have been tested in 1944 and 1945. And for comparison, here is the well-known US gadget or Fat Man design from purely unclassified sources. So the diagram of the bomb and the dimensions, the function of the various layers of this spherical bomb. This is the US version. Here is the German version. We have a bunch of different sources now, from German sources, from former Soviet archives, from US archives, a bunch of different sources that actually give us the details about this bomb design. We can put it side by side and see that it looks an awful lot like the US Gadget or Fat Man, except in a few respects it's more advanced. It has 2 neutron initiators that are both more advanced than the so-called Urchin neutron initiator that the US used. And its method of using explosives appears to be more advanced to get better compression, better implosion than the US version. And this was overall somewhat lighter than the US bomb. This was 2 tons. The US bomb was more like 3 tons. So this probably could have had a yield of several tens of kilotons if given a full load of fuel. It appears that the Germans, when they tested this, used as little fuel as possible, just enough to achieve criticality. They didn't want to use up too much of their precious fuel, and they probably didn't want to make too big of a mess on German territory or invite too much scrutiny by observers. Now, that's not simply a paper design, but you've seen the components of that design, and now I can tell you which specific German companies manufactured those components, or at least manufactured components that match the descriptions there. The first of the 2 neutron initiators was made by the CHF Mueller Company in Hamburg, according to post-war Allied investigations. And again, this is much better than the Urchin that the US version used. And the second neutron initiator was made by the Siemens Electrical Company in Erlangen. The uranium-235 fission pit was made by the sites we discussed earlier. The pit would have been surrounded by an unenriched metal uranium tamper, probably made by the Auer or Degussa companies in Oranienburg or elsewhere. That was surrounded by what's described apparently as cadmium electroplated aluminum. And from these post-war Allied investigations, we know the companies that were capable of manufacturing cadmium electroplated aluminum. The cadmium is there as a neutron absorber. And then the TNT and the RDX would have come from Wassag in Allendorf or other locations. The explosive lenses, using those 2 different explosives combined in a geometrical structure as a lens to optimize the implosion, they were designed by the German army and actually tested. So here are photographs of German explosive lenses being tested in 1943. The US didn't get serious about German explosive lenses until late 44 and early 45. Here's 1943. And then simultaneous detonators to set off all this, electrical detonators. Also, we know they were developed by the German army. And the explosives were supplemented with liquid oxygen to get better implosion. And there was plenty of liquid oxygen available from the V2 rocket program at Friedrichshafen and other places. So you've seen the small design, medium design, and then it also came in supersize. According to over 30 different independent sources, during the war, Germany was developing a full-scale H-bomb. It sounds hard to believe. It sounds like 1950 stuff in the 1940s. But according to these sources, Germany was developing a full-scale H-bomb using fusion fuel that was lithium deuteride. And I know that lithium was produced at Oak Ridge after the war. So they were doing similar things in Germany during the war. So lithium deuteride fusion fuel, according to these sources, and then a fission bomb primary. It even describes radiation implosion used in this. The bomb would have had a total mass of about 6,000 kilograms and a yield of about 1.6 or so megatons, so quite a big bang. And although this was not tested during the war, they were expecting to test it if the war had continued later in 1945 or in early 1946. So this was far from a paper design. This is very close to actually being tested. So a very advanced German H-bomb. Now, the smaller bombs, the small and the medium, do seem to have been tested. The earliest successful reported test was from October 1944 on the Baltic coast. And we have reports from a number of independent sources of this test. So it's quite impressive. We have reports from Axis observers who were on the ground monitoring this test from a bunker nearby. We have reports from Axis observers who were assigned to be in the air observing this test. We have reports from the OSS. We have reports from the Manhattan Project. We have a number of different reports on this. The second apparent test happened about a month or so later in Poland. And again, we have a number of reports on this. According to these reports, it appears that the Germans unfortunately used humans as guinea pigs. They wanted to test the effect of the nuclear explosion on humans. So quite a very tragic event, but a number of reports describing this. And then the final tests seem to have occurred in Thuringia in central Germany in March 1945. And again, we have quite a number of reports. Most of these are Soviet intelligence reports that describe this test and describe the design in great detail. But there are also Allied reports from Allied intelligence describing the same thing, and from Heinrich Himmler's adjutant describing this as well. So quite a number of reports here. Now, people always see that and they say, great, let me grab my Geiger counter. I want to go out and go roaming around Germany with my Geiger counter and find where they tested this stuff. And goodness knows we'd like to do that. But from the physics, it's simply not possible. We know from well-known nuclear physics that the radioactivity from a nuclear explosion decays over time. And here it's been over 80 years now. So after 80 years, the radioactivity from this nuclear explosion or any of these would have dropped by about a factor of 1 billion fold from what they were immediately after the explosion. So if you do the math, you work out that if this actually happened, if you were to measure the residual radioactivity at the test site, it'd be around 10 to 30 times smaller than the natural background radiation levels. So you couldn't detect it with your trusty Geiger counter. That's if everything remained at the test site, kind of like Trinity. But these were tested not in the middle of a desert like Trinity, but tested in the areas where there's lots of snow and rain and everything. So it probably washed stuff all over the place. It'd be even harder to detect. So it is very hard to prove or disprove these tests with modern methods. But if somebody out there has the resources to do this, has the money to do this, can persuade the German government to let them do this, I'd love to see somebody try. I think it may be possible to take soil samples from a number of different sites. And then since you can't look for overall radioactivity, that's too low, do very sensitive laboratory tests. And even if you can't see the fission products, maybe you can see other things from the bomb, like the very heavy natural uranium tamper that was blown to smithereens. So I'd really love to see somebody try that if they have the resources. I would encourage them. Now, we know from quite a number of other documents that Hitler strongly supported all this nuclear weapons development. You often hear, well, Hitler didn't know about this, Hitler didn't care about nuclear weapons, Hitler didn't like nuclear weapons. No, we actually have quite a number of quotes from people in Hitler's inner circle that from 1939 until the very end of the war, spring 45, Hitler was very, very, very excited about the possibilities of nuclear weapons. And to further back that up, we have a series of photographs from German archives. This is Hitler surrounded by nuclear scientists. So he liked it enough. He was doing a photo op with nuclear scientists. This is Kurt Diebner. This appears to be Werner Heisenberg back here. Fritz Strassmann, one of the discoverers of fission. Rolf Wiederow, a particle accelerator expert here. So doing a photo op with nuclear scientists at Linz, kind of the middle of nowhere in Austria, in April 1943, over 2 years before the end of the war. And I doubt that they were here to open a new discotheque. So this was at a facility called the Reichswerke Hermann Göring in Linz. We know absolutely nothing about what was produced at that facility, but from Leslie Groves' own records, we know that about a year and a half later, Leslie Groves was personally informed that whatever this facility was had been bombed flat by the Allies. And Leslie Groves appears to have been pleased enough at that intelligence that he put it in his files, and it was filed under positive intelligence, proof positive about the German nuclear weapons program. Then it appears from a number of sources that multiple nuclear weapons were not only tested, but completed and stockpiled and available by the end of the war if Hitler were sufficiently grumpy. So we have this testimony from a number of different independent sources that there were multiple nuclear weapons available. So the question is, why did Germany not actually use these nuclear weapons? And we even have the answer for that. We know that from 1943 until the end of the war, FDR and Churchill publicly threatened Germany that if they used any sorts of weapons of mass destruction, the Allies would respond by escalating the Allied bombing. They wouldn't simply do what they had been doing in the Allied bombing, but they would start dropping mustard gas and phosgene and really nasty stuff, and potentially killing millions of German civilians. So it was mutual assured destruction, MAD, kind of a post-war concept, but here during the war, that appears to have deterred the Germans. So this was the Allied threat, and we know from multiple Axis sources that it worked, that Hitler decided not to use these nuclear weapons or to use his chemical weapons, which we also know he had, because of these threats. Then for the Allied side, we can see that the Allies very clearly believed in the existence of German nuclear weapons. And we can see from wartime Allied reports, this is from in the fall of 1944. So even showing up in Time magazine and the New York Times, they're reporting, hey, German scientists are developing a new spherical implosion bomb to implode uranium and have a blast radius of several kilometers. And it has a neutron initiator. They actually reported this unclassified in these Western media sources. And as you can imagine, when Leslie Groves read that in Time magazine, he kind of had a hissy fit. And so there's actually, evidence about Leslie Groves' reaction to that when he discovered all this. And then here is from December 9th, 1944. This was one of FDR's secretaries reporting that on that day, FDR had been informed that Germany has developed a bomb with a blast radius of over a mile, and that this German program is greatly ahead of where the Manhattan Project was at the same time. This appears to have been a presidential briefing from 2 days later, from December 11th, 1944. One of only 2 copies of this, so eyes only, probably for FDR. And here is the summary page, followed by several pages of evidence. The first paragraph says that we have intelligence, we have evidence that Germany has developed atomic bombs and is working on methods of delivering them to Allied targets. And for this intelligence evidence, see tab A. So I thought, great, I really, really, really want to read this tab A. This must be great stuff. So you go to it, and nope, access restricted, withdrawal notice, yellow card, no soup for you. So even 80 years later, this evidence is still classified and withheld. There are many other examples of that. These were from post-war reports. And these came from a number of top military officials in both the US and in Great Britain, stating, based on their post-war investigations, they knew that Germany had been developing or had developed atomic bombs during the war and could potentially have used them. So from Eisenhower and everybody else here. Now we have these public statements, but we don't have the actual reports based on that. And these are not the sort of people who would make these sort of statements just off the cuff or making things up. This must have been based on very, very detailed Allied investigation reports, but those are still classified and unavailable. On that note, where are all of the Allied reports on all of the suspected or known nuclear facilities in German territory during the war? Nuclear facilities that are cited by name in other reports, such as these. So here are some of the known or suspected German nuclear sites. If you ever feel like being a tourist in Europe, you can visit all of these. So here are named sites, and then after the war, we know that the Allies visited these sites. We know because they stopped to take selfies at these sites. So here's Monty, here's Eisenhower and so forth, Patton taking selfies at these sites. We know they were there, but we don't have any written reports for actually what they found there. What was the site like? What were they producing? What was removed from the site? How about interrogations? There are no interrogation reports for personnel at these sites. It's all still classified and buried. Now, in addition to stuff that stayed there in Europe, there was stuff that was shipped out of Europe during the war, international shipments to Japan and possibly other destinations. We know from documents that Germany and Japan were collaborating on nuclear weapons and shipping material relevant to that from Germany to Japan. That was throughout the war. And then at the very end of the war, Germany dispatched at least 10 submarines loaded with the very latest weapons technology and materials to Japan. And of those 10 submarines, at least 6 were captured intact by the Allies. So where are those captured submarines? Where is everything that was captured on them? All the materials, all the documents that were captured on them? We have virtually nothing from those 6 submarines. Here is one of just a few pages available on just one of those submarines. And it says that the submarine was brought into port and it had uranium oxide, but not just any old garden variety uranium oxide like everyone has in their house, but this was uranium oxide that had to be stored in very special gold-lined cylinders, and that the German sailors on board told the Allies unloading the submarine, now be very, very careful with that uranium, handle it like TNT. It can become sensitive and dangerous if you mishandle it. So it certainly sounds like enriched uranium. That was just one item from just one of these subs, so it was on all these different submarines. And where are all the reports on that? And then personnel. Perhaps the closest analog of Leslie Groves in Germany was Hans Kammler. Hans Kammler was an SS general, also had a PhD in engineering, and by the end of the war, he was in charge of the German nuclear weapons program and other advanced weapons programs, as stated by multiple independent archival sources. He was the guy in charge of the nuclear program. Now, officially, he died in May 1945, which makes it kind of difficult to find out anything. But luckily, we have multiple reports from U.S. archives saying that, no, not did he not die in May 45, but as late as many months later, he was alive and in U.S. custody and singing like a canary. So very sprightly for a dead guy. Now, we have these reports that he was being interrogated, but we actually don't have the details of those interrogations. So what did he say? What did he provide? And he was also implicated in many aspects of the Holocaust. So for the U.S. to harbor this person after the war, never turn him over to other countries who wanted him, never turn him over to the Nuremberg process, never admit that he survived the war, he must have provided something very, very important to the U.S. in exchange for all this. So where are all those reports? They're all still classified and buried. He was the top general in charge of.
Do you know what happened to him?
Everybody wants to know what happened to him. So officially, he died in May 45. This he was alive at least as late as November 45, so at least 6 months later.
Yeah.
And then after that, the paper trail just vanishes.
Okay.
And people have done FOIAs for this, Freedom of Information Act requests. And the FOIAs return that there are at least two more Kamla-related documents. They're still classified. You can't see them, but at least mention that they exist. I think one was from the 1960s, and I think one from the early 1980s. And either one of those would be a plausible death date for Kamler if he lived a long natural life. So goodness knows. I mean, maybe they kept him in prison for his life. Maybe they kept him someplace in Europe. Maybe he lived happily ever after in Nebraska, for all we know.
Okay.
Everybody wants to know what happened to him, and there must be lots of documents on that, but they're not releasing them. Now, he was the top general for the project. This was the top scientist, apparently, for the project, Siegfried Pflüger. In 1939, he published detailed calculations about fission reactors and fission bombs, and he appears to have worked for all different aspects of this program. As I said at the beginning, the German nuclear program was distributed over many different sites, many different countries, many different agencies, and he was the indispensable man because according to his resume, he was working at all of them. And we also know that after the war, in 1947, Edward Teller was trying to become the father of the H-bomb, and he was having a little trouble conceiving. And so here is a memo that Edward Teller in 1947 urgently requests that they go dig up Siegfried Pflüger in Europe and put him on a plane and bring him over to help Edward Teller. And by golly, they did. And this is a revolutionary. I mean, you read, histories of the H-bomb development in the U.S. after the war. You never come to a chapter where Edward Teller throws up his hands and says, by golly, I'm stumped. Let's bring in the Germans who are building the German H-bomb. But here it is. In black and yellow here on this aged paper. And when Siegfried Pflüger was not in the U.S. helping his newfound buddy Teller, he was visiting home in Europe, and he was constantly kept under U.S. security and surveillance in Europe through at least the 1950s, courtesy of one of the former top officials of the ALSOS mission. And those are just two examples, but there are many more. There are dozens of experts who would have had knowledge of the German nuclear program, including the H-bomb development program, who were brought to the US and or UK. We have their smiling photos. We don't have too much more. And then there were a bunch more that were perhaps never brought to the US, but were interrogated in Europe or were taken to other countries like France, the UK, Soviet Union. And we have these brief mentions that, oh yeah, we just found out that this guy, that guy, the other guy was building nuclear bombs during the war. There must be very juicy follow-on reports about that, but those follow-on reports are all still classified. You can't read them. In fact, there's a lot you can't read. I showed you some of the yellow withdrawal cards from the U.S. National Archives earlier, access restricted, withdrawal notice. They put these to inform you, at least, we have this wonderful document, and we're going to be rude to you. You can't read this wonderful document, but at least you know it exists. So here are all these different withdrawal cards for files from Leslie Groves on the German atomic bomb that you can't read 80 years later. There are all these, and all these, and these, and these, and these. But wait, there's more. It slices, it dices. There are these, and 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 a whole lot more where that came from. So if the German program was so small, so primitive, why do we have all of these documents about the German nuclear weapons program, and why are they still classified and withheld 80 years after the war? So again, if you read most modern history books, they say the German program to develop nuclear weapons was very small, very primitive, didn't get terribly far. But from the documents you've seen, from other documents on my website, here are examples of people who were in a position to know and who concluded that the German program was not small and not primitive. And its top U.S. officials from FDR on down, all kinds of generals and other military officials, top scientists, Manhattan Project scientists, top investigative reporters from the U.S., all kinds of Axis people from Adolf Hitler on down through officials, long list of scientists, other witnesses. Top people in the UK, from Churchill on down, all vouching for this. Top people in the Soviet Union, from Stalin's inner circle on down, all vouching for this. But wait, we also have Czech sources, we have Dutch sources, we have French sources, we have Polish sources, Swedish sources, Swiss sources. We have all kinds of different sources here. They're all saying the same thing. It's all been ignored by the history books. So to conclude, we have all of these archival documents stating that, at least according to these reports, during the war, Germany obtained thousands of tons of uranium and thorium ores on a very high priority basis and processed that at least 20 different sites and was manufacturing, mass producing uranium gas centrifuges all over the place and was employing tens of thousands of workers in plants to enrich uranium and was building dedicated power plants to provide electricity for those, and was producing heavy water at least 27 different sites all over Europe, and was producing tens of thousands of tons of other nuclear-related materials, and was building apparently large underground octagonal pool fission reactors you can see with your own eyes on aerial surveillance photos, and was developing and testing spherical implosion bombs and explosive lenses from 1940 onward, you can see with your own eyes in photographs, and was building, mass-producing, shipping neutron initiators that were even better than the ones the US had for its bombs, and was conducting large test explosions, as reported by many different sources, and you can actually even see evidence from aerial surveillance photos, and was telling its top officials and leaders of other countries that Germany possessed or would soon possess nuclear weapons, and was developing delivery vehicles to carry those weapons to Allied targets. So if you saw some random modern country, let's call it Kirplakistan, just to pick a random example. So you saw Kirplakistan, it's not supposed to be a nuclear power, but you suddenly receive thousands of pages of intelligence from highly placed sources saying that Kirplakistan is doing all these different things. Now, would you conclude that, oh, it's obvious from all that Kirplakistan has no nuclear weapons program and there's no need for us to investigate a possible nuclear weapons program there? No, I mean, you would conclude that we obviously have to look more into this. There's something really fishy going on in Kirplakistan. There's a lot more information on my website. I encourage people to look at that, but it's not the complete story by any means. In order to get the complete story, we have to get all these documents declassified and released. Some of them we at least know where they are. Some of them we don't even know where they are, but we know that they must exist, like interrogations of Hans Kammler and so forth. And so I'd encourage people to, search for those documents, lobby to have those files released. And then for people who are in Europe or can potentially visit Europe, it'd be quite fascinating to conduct industrial archaeology digs at those dozens of different sites I showed on my map. Now, if you do that, please dig very carefully. Goodness knows what there might be buried down there. But to be able to dig that up and then to do laboratory analyses on isotopes and things could be quite fascinating. So there's a whole lot more information on my website. Here's the address, riderinstitute.org. I encourage people to go there. You can download all this for free. There's over 6,000 pages of this. If you have insomnia, this is a great solution. There are these slides and a whole lot more slides as well. So I'll stop there.
Oh, excellent. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. It was a good summary and a lot of new information you provided. I think you have done an excellent job in this research. And as I promised, I will talk with Dick Groves and see if I can make a connection for you there.
Thank you very much.
All right. Well, folks, thank you for watching Hidden History, Stories from the Secret City. Our next guest on our next program will be Natasha Bajema. She's been on before, and she's going to talk about generative artificial intelligence and how she's using that. So encourage you to join us next time. Thanks again, Todd.
Thank you.